Hey everyone, Miv here, and welcome to my Completionist playthrough of Icewind Dale, done in a Purist style, on insane difficulty. Such a snappy title, just rolls off your tongue. Anyway, in this introduction video, I'll explain that headline and discuss various other elements of this Let's Play. If you'd like to jump straight into the gameplay, feel free to skip to episode 1, and we'll see each other in East Haven. However, as usual, I invite you to stay a while and listen, because here I will elaborate on my plans and ideas for this run, as well as present a deep look into the party we'll be playing. Hopefully you'll find at least some of these subjects interesting. As always, there will be timestamps in the description to help you navigate between all the topics. The major segments of this video will involve first talking about the game itself and some of its technical elements, such as why we are playing the Enhanced Edition, why this version of it, and a little info about mods, both the ones already incorporated by the Enhanced Edition, as well as possible installs I didn't go for. Next, we'll cover all of the core concepts for the run, the difficulty settings and other gameplay related info. Following that, we'll discuss everything concerning our party, my general approach to it, as well as a detailed presentation of each party member. And finally, before we start playing, we'll watch the game's intro cinematic and the initial in-game introduction, so that we can get ourselves into the proper mood and then jump right into the action in episode 1. I'll try not to go into extreme detail whenever it's not warranted, and some subjects I'll tackle as they come along during the playthrough, not to front load everything here, but still, this will be a long video, especially the party segment, so consider yourselves warned. Now, having that in mind, feel free to sit back, grab a snack, and let's attack. Icewind Dale is one of the Infinity Engine role-playing games, together with Baldur's Gate and Planescape Torment. All three series bear a lot of similarities, being isometric, party-oriented RPGs based on the Dungeons & Dragons system, but at the same time, they are also quite different from each other in many ways. It's always been a general, long-standing consensus that Icewind Dale is the most combat-focused of the three, with Planescape Torment being its polar opposite, as the most story-driven and role-playing oriented title. And then of course we have Baldur's Gate, which is the perfect combination, taking the best of both worlds. I generally agree with that assessment, however I fervently oppose the comparisons Icewind Dale sometimes receives to hack and slash titles, being dismissed as a game that doesn't offer much besides combat. In my opinion, that's unfair, undeserved, and could not be further from the truth. Not to get into a long rant about this, I just want to say that, while certainly not flawless, Icewind Dale is a proper RPG with a wealth of good content within, gameplay mechanics that offer tons of replay value, an incredible atmosphere to get yourself immersed to, accompanied by a great soundtrack, and many lesser known and hidden things to discover. All of that packaged into a classic D&D adventure. Long story short, this game has way more to offer than it gets credit for. One of the objectives of this playthrough is to present Icewind Dale's quality and do the game's justice. Hopefully, my attempt at this will not be a complete failure, as I really love this game and would like it to receive a showcase it deserves. I'll try my best to deliver it. Now, some of the most notable gameplay features that make Icewind Dale different from other Infinity Engine games include designing your entire party instead of just the protagonist, a more elaborate random drop system within the game, aside from static loot, the adventure being linear, an emphasis on dungeon crawling, a different style fights focused on battling hordes of enemies, and finally there are plenty of class and spell differences, especially in comparison to Baldur's Gate. Icewind Dale is still available and perfectly playable in its classic form, but we'll go through the game on the Enhanced Edition, version 1.4. Generally, I'm not a big fan of all those HD remakes, remastered, re-releases and the like, but this one gets a pass from me, as it does include some nice features, especially if you don't cross the border into the 2.0 plus line of patches. I'd like to quickly address some of those features here, since I'll be referring back to them later on in the video. Besides the standard updates to higher resolutions in the game engine, the main additions include: first, a lot of class kits and spells, basically brought over from Baldur's Gate 2, as well as a few new items. This part will not play a role in this playthrough, as I will later explain. What will be utilized and appreciated are some of the nice improvements to the UI, like quick loot, which really shines in this game, the ability to see the names and health status of all creatures on the screen instead of having to highlight each one individually, different colors for different types of damage, and so on. Just neat little convenience tweaks that smooth out the gameplay a bit. However, most important for me are the new customization options in regards to difficulty, which we will take advantage of to make things more fun. Aside from that, the Enhanced Edition implements features from the following mods. First off, Icewind Dale Fixback, correcting a lot of bugs, oversights, and the like, plus they add their own fixes as well. Then secondly, Unfinished Business, which brings quite a few nice restorations to various parts of the game, which I'll point out as we go along. It also restores some items and random drops, but the Enhanced Edition sometimes makes minor changes here. For instance, they moved the location of 2 random drops to places a little later in the game. Next up, the Item Upgrade mod that expands the list of craftable items by adding a few, but it's a partial implementation, because they left out some quivers and returning throne items the mod would normally place in relevant shops. And lastly, kind of a trimmed down version of the Add Bags of Holding component from the classic Icewind Dale tweaks, which adds purchasable ammo belts and an extra bag of holding for some inventory convenience. I would have all of the above installed if they weren't already a part of the Enhanced Edition. As for other mods, I decided not to install any, for the simple reason that they wouldn't fit this playthrough, as I don't want to change the game's content, rules, or design choices. I want us to experience the excellence of Icewind Dale without any major additions or alterations. I like the mod content already incorporated in the Enhanced Edition, and that's enough. Also, related to the above is the fact that, unfortunately, the mod selection for Icewind Dale isn't nearly as broad as it is for Baldur's Gate, and most of them focus on changes that I'm simply not interested in for a run like this. Either modifying the rules or mechanics, or adding new class kits into the game, all of which are beyond the scope of this series. There are of course notable mods out there, ranging from classic overhauls like Aurel's Bane, to things like the Icewind Dale NPC project, which allows you to have recruitable companions with banters, interjections, and so on. But like I said, this is not the playthrough for that kind of stuff. Maybe in the future I'll have a chance to do a run with a heavier mod installation, but for now, we will keep things as they are. Now a quick word about the game version we'll be playing on. 1.4 is the last patch before 2.0 and its successors, which brought a lot of changes that I don't like and consider unnecessary or excessive. They just altered the look and feel of the game too much, in my opinion. Version 1.4, on the other hand, still retains the spirit of the original Icewind Dale and is the pinnacle of Enhanced Edition quality in my book. This is just a preference thing, so I'll just leave it at that. In case you want to downgrade to this version, the only simple way I know of is to have the game on the Good Old Games platform. Through their launcher, GOG Galaxy, you can choose the version you want from a wider selection, and it seems to be a general feature they have for many titles. That is really cool, and something I truly appreciate. Still on the technical side of things, let me just mention that I have the so-called cosmetic attacks disabled, and I'll use the Ctrl-J command occasionally to teleport my party members to their destination quicker. It will be used for backtracking or to speed up moving from one side of the map to the other, such that we don't have to watch our characters walk for minutes. And also, to skip going all the way around that giant route in Kuldahar. If you've played the game, you definitely know what I'm talking about. Now, the time has come for me to explain what I understand by those concept names from earlier. And first, let's tackle the Completionist descriptor, as it is fundamental to the run, and quite straightforward. This basically represents my intention to showcase everything the game has to offer, from the basic tasks, such as doing a full exploration with all quests and all encounters, through crafting and upgrading all items, to discussing every random drop table and showing the available unique conversation options, lesser known things, and anything else that doesn't fall under the previous categories. Essentially, we'll do everything we can do within the span of one playthrough. That's the caveat. Naturally, in the run, we'll have to make choices in regards to some outcomes, doing things one way instead of another, and even having a maximum of 6 party members, we won't have access to every unique dialogue option possible. The same issue pertains to crafting and upgrading items. We won't be able to experience this with every single available item in the game, as some require you to go through the expansion and come back to the original campaign, while some others require the exact opposite, going through the original campaign first and then progressing to the expansion. Not to mention, some of those items are random drops we might not even get, And finally, there are some very expensive purchases, completely irrelevant to our party and beyond our financial means. In any such case though, I will talk about whatever notable thing we're not seeing, explain its crafting or upgrading process, and show it on a screenshot, so no need to worry. Also, as always, I don't claim to know absolutely everything or to be the best at the game. I can only assure you that I'll try my hardest to provide an informative and hopefully enjoyable playthrough, showcasing as many things as I can. The second most important core concept is my Purist approach. What this refers to is my intention to focus on the original Icewind Dale content without the distractions introduced by the Enhanced Edition. My main reason for it is to not dilute the game's uniqueness. On the contrary, I want to highlight the cool characteristics of Icewind Dale and how it's different from Baldur's Gate, instead of making it more like it, using the same spells and class kits. They add some novelty, of course, that allows us to experience the game differently, but this is not what this playthrough is about, and I'm sure there's plenty of runs out there utilizing those. Here, we will experience things how they were meant to be, and make this playthrough a tribute to the classic Icewind Dale. Furthermore, it is my strong belief that it will be more interesting and fun that way, and to support that claim, let me present a quick analysis of the particular additions and changes and how using them would not be in our best interest. Because as much as that stuff can potentially enrich a run, it can just as well cheapen the experience in many ways. The common theme with these additions is that they are either too powerful, trivializing some parts of the experience, or are redundant, overlapping with things already present in the game. Now, to be fair, there are a few of them that fit in decently well, and I briefly considered making some exceptions for those, but quickly realized that then we would be getting ourselves into a convoluted mess of arbitrary picks. I ultimately decided it's better to go with a clear concept and focus on pure, original Icewind Dale, as God intended. A quick side note about the too powerful aspect before we go further. It's not to say that the original game didn't have its broken spell combos and such, or that there's no fun to be had in going for a power gaming run where you do take advantage of all of the Enhanced Edition stuff and totally destroy all opposition. That's all fine and up to the player's discretion. I'm just saying that this playthrough is supposed to be a different experience, with some hardships involved, and so I wouldn't have used all of those strong new options anyway. So finally, there's 4 types of the content-related additions we'll give a hard pass to: class kits, spells, items, and mechanics. Now, that might sound like we're missing out on a lot, but as you'll see in a moment, that's not the case at all. When it comes to class kits, in my opinion, they are the strongest out of the additions, and certainly provide more options for party planning and replayability. However, there are 2 issues here. First one is what I will repeat a lot: some of them are just too good in the environment of Icewind Dale. I'll go into more detail in the party creation segment to highlight some of the biggest offenders and explain how and why they excel in this game. However, the most fundamental and important reason for not using class kits in this playthrough is the fact that the base classes in Icewind Dale are already quite different from their Baldur's Gate counterparts, and that's a really cool feature of the game. Most of them gain access to new tricks and abilities, or enjoy changes to some of their mechanics, while some particular classes, like the Druid and Bard for instance, are so vastly improved that it's simply a must to showcase. It would be such a disservice to this game to go for the class kits we know already from Baldur's Gate, instead of highlighting what Icewind Dale brings to the table here. Now, the spells the Enhanced Edition introduces are quite plentiful, but the vast majority fall under one of 3 categories. They are either too powerful, completely outclassing and overshadowing the competition, are too similar to spells that already exist in the game, or have little or no practical purpose in Icewind Dale, as they were clearly meant for a different game. I'll point out to specific examples of all of them as we go along in the playthrough. Spells that don't fit into any of the aforementioned groups are not only rare, but most of them are pretty insignificant and not a big deal. There are only a few exceptions that add something nice and fitting, in my opinion. The biggest positive difference the Enhanced Edition makes in practice is when you play a high-level campaign on the Heart of Fury mode, where the addition of a few more level 9 arcane spells is welcome, since the original game only had 2. It won't be a concern for us though, as in most cases with a full party and non-boosted XP, those spells never come into play. In those normal circumstances, you only ever reach level 8 spells extremely late in the run. An important thing to note here is that, similarly to the class situation, Icewind Dale by itself offers a much different magic environment from Baldur's Gate, and I want to keep the spotlight on that aspect. It is achieved in a few ways. There are many new arcane and divine spells that weren't a part of Baldur's Gate. Many spells present in both games work differently in each one, and sometimes in a major way. And finally, the format of fights in Icewind Dale incentivizes different selections for our spellcasters. The list of commonly used premium picks here differs from what we're used to in Baldur's Gate. Therefore, without any external additions, Icewind Dale will provide us with its own distinct magical experience, and that's great. Using some of the powerful newcomers from the Enhanced Edition would only detract from it. As for the items, the Enhanced Edition introduces only a few, and again, I wouldn't have used most of them anyway, since they are either disproportionately strong or fill in equipment gaps that won't matter for us, like katanas or monk items. In practice, I basically like the design of only one Iron Stone, so giving it up is not an issue at all. Finally, the mechanics we will forego using are weapon style proficiencies, thief skills like set traps or detect illusion, and the ability to dual wield weapons. As usual, some of those are quite overkill, like traps or dual wielding with all the speed weapons available in this game, while for some others, like detect illusion, there's hardly any practical application. Also, it didn't fit anywhere else, but I'm not going to use the half-orc race as it wasn't a part of the original game either. So, to summarize, from the Enhanced Edition, we'll take the UI improvements, difficulty customization, and mod integration, but we'll leave out the gameplay content additions and changes, remaining faithful to the classic Icewind Dale in that area. The last key element of the playthrough will be its high difficulty. I don't really do these videos to prove anything in that regard, but I do enjoy playing games on hard difficulties and coming up with additional challenges to spice things up. Such settings often lead to a fuller, more satisfying experience, and so I had a few ideas for this run as well. The high difficulty will be achieved through a variety of means, and it's only appropriate to first discuss the most basic and fundamental one, the difficulty slider, especially since it's quite a bit more involved compared to Baldur's Gate. When set to core, it offers the intended mechanics and values for the D&D system, and you can't really go wrong with that. However, when it comes to going higher than core, you might be surprised there are 3 different consequences of it. The first one is what we know from Baldur's Gate, receiving more damage. On hard difficulty, it's 50% more, and on insane, it's doubled. Doesn't matter what source of damage we're talking about. Enemies or our own spells, for instance, will take double of what we would normally suffer. Now, the next 2 elements are new in Icewind Dale. The first one kind of mirrors the damage increases and was presumably meant to offset the weight of the other 2 detrimental effects. It increases the experience gained by 50% on hard and 100% on insane, no matter the source, monsters, quests, all of it. I don't like that, and it used to be a major problem for me in classic Icewind Dale, as there weren't any mods to my knowledge that altered this behavior back then. However, here the Enhanced Edition comes to the rescue big time, as it allows us to turn it off. We'll get to that in just a moment. But for now, let's finish this exposition with the third and last consequence of hard and especially insane difficulty, one that I absolutely love: more enemy spawns. This makes the game so much more interesting, as the additional monsters are introduced in a couple of ways. Sometimes it's more opponents in an already existing encounter, usually elite, tougher types of bad guys. Sometimes it's a completely new group of enemies in a place where there wouldn't be any. But my favorite type of those extra adversaries are a few select, rare or completely unique foes that normally don't show up in the game at all, or almost at all. I want to avoid spoilers, so I'll have to stop myself here, but I want to emphasize how cool some of these additions are, and how much they improve certain fights and locations. Of course, I will point out all of them as we progress through the game. Now, the Enhanced Edition adds a great deal of customization here, with the ability to turn off the changes to experience gained and the changes to the damage received. With those toggles, you can adjust the difficulty as you see fit. The main advantage is that you can enjoy the additional enemy spawns coming from hard or insane, while keeping the core damage values and/or turning off the bonus experience. And even though I focused on discussing the above core difficulties, you could go below it to remove some mechanics, like the chance to fail when scribing spells or the risk of permanent death, but still keep the damage or experience as if it was core. So whatever combo you prefer. More customization is always good, but this feature specifically is something I truly appreciate and is one of the major reasons we are playing the Enhanced Edition. In our playthrough, we'll put the slider all the way up to insane, and we will turn off the extra experience while keeping the double damage. This is as much as we can do with the slider to make things tougher for ourselves. I really appreciate the option to keep the experience at its base values, being able to progress our characters at an intended pace. Because otherwise, with the abundance of experience, we would have a difficult beginning, yeah, but quickly after that, we would shoot up in levels and outscale the opponents, having access to spells, abilities, and raw stats that we shouldn't have. So thank Ao the Overfather for that option. The slider is of course not the only method to improve the general difficulty. The second most impactful way to influence it will be the suboptimal design of our party. We will of course delve into the details during the appropriate segment of this video, but suffice to say, our characters will have shortcomings and weaknesses of various kinds, as well as more arbitrary restrictions to limit their performance. There will be no dual classing, no Icewind Dale Grand Mastery, and no high attribute totals. As a result, their power level will be quite diminished compared to what most players are used to, I suppose. The next few important elements and settings fall under the umbrella of the no reload approach I will employ. It's of course about dealing with whatever happens without using saving and reloading, that much is clear. But there are a couple of tangible consequences I'd like to call attention to. First of all, I'll keep the max HP on level up option turned off, so we will have to accept the randomness of hit point rolls. It can be quite problematic for a character to keep getting low values, especially during the first few level ups, so we'll have to hope for Timora to smile on us and grant us some luck in that regard, but if it is Beshaba who curses us with misfortune, well, we'll have to deal with it. Next thing are the random drops. We'll have to be grateful for whatever we get. I don't have any mods allowing us to choose which drops we want, and of course I won't reload to get a better item. Another aspect of it will be my general attitude to minimize our reliance on luck. This will be evident in how I'll proceed with certain chance-based situations like pickpocketing or scribing spells. Not having the opportunity to retry if something goes wrong, I'll only do it when we have the necessary tools to ensure the highest probability of success we can realistically achieve. So we will help our luck as much as possible. And finally, a word about resting, which will contribute to the difficulty to some degree. I have the rest until healed option turned off, so that rests will always last for just 8 hours, and for every such occurrence, we'll have to accept the chance of being interrupted by enemies when in hostile territory. But this is more about explaining my preference here of how I don't like resting too often, and it's because of both gameplay and role-playing reasons. Gameplay-wise, it's just not my style to rest after every other encounter and always having my full spellbook ready. I find it more satisfying to keep going for a while and to use my resources wherever it's the most fitting to try to get decent value out of them. I like to think ahead and plan the usage of spells over the course of a whole area or a certain part of the adventure. It also feels better to me in role-playing terms to make an effort to rest where it makes the most sense, to always try to find a safe space meant for it, and when resting in dangerous locations, to make sure to clear out the map or a whole dungeon level beforehand, for example. And by the way, this is not to criticize anyone who likes to rest more often or anything like that. This is a game that's meant to be fun, so of course it's up to the player to decide how they want to handle it, and that's fine. I'm just explaining how I prefer to play. Now, to summarize and provide some conclusions to the entire difficulty section, I'll quickly highlight some particular end results of playing on our settings. One of the negatives of receiving double damage is that, especially in the beginning, Fighting with enemies in a toe-to-toe fashion is discouraged, to put it mildly. With limited tactical options early on, it usually forces a kiting-heavy playstyle or lots of crowd control. And we will have to resort to stuff like that to some extent, but here I'd like to take this opportunity to mention that I will always try to have some tactical variety in the playthrough, so that things don't get too repetitive and we can mitigate this downside somewhat. It will get better, especially once we unlock some spells and abilities after the prologue. However, we will always have to keep a degree of safety in our playstyle, because on Insane, the threat of permanent death is very real. Our party members can permanently die when overkilled by 20 or more hit points, and needless to say, suffering double damage makes it significantly easier to reach that threshold. Whenever that happens, the character explodes into pieces, their portrait is removed from our list, and they disappear from the game forever. This will be a constant source of fear for me and a motivator to play well. If such a thing happens, I do have some ideas on how to deal with it in order not to jeopardize the completionist part of the run, but I will do everything in my power to avoid such tragedies, of course. Well, so far it all sounds pretty dire, but there are upsides as well. One of the positive aspects of our settings is that they will make the encounters more relevant and give them more meaning. There will be less filler fights, where we can just left-click and watch. There will be danger even in simple skirmishes, and as such, there will be more significance to our tactics. We will have to be on our guard, even against a lowly goblin or skeleton. Even those seemingly trivial enemies will have the potential to ruin things for us, and will have to be treated seriously. This will be especially meaningful during those parts of the game where the difficulty curve goes into a dip. The segments where, normally, the player can take a breather, relax, and stop trying as much for a while. In our case, such slacking will not be allowed, and those traditionally easier locations will gain a lot from our settings and become dangerous and fun again. Also, the suboptimal design of our party will have more far-reaching ramifications other than just our characters not being as powerful as usual. We'll have to work around their shortcomings, which means we will have to dedicate more spell slots for buffs that normally aren't used often. We'll have to carefully utilize our consumables and resources, and we won't be able to deal with a lot of fights by simply going in and defeating them in physical combat. We'll have to think of other solutions. In general, referencing one of my favorite quotes from Icewind Dale 2 by a priest of the Red Knight, Denham Fisher, battle plans that could be summarized as "get 'em" will not be acceptable most of the time for us. We will have to devise something better. We will face financial difficulties too with our set of rules. Having to craft weak items I would normally skip will be a gold drain for questionable upsides, if that. Being purists, we won't gain additional cash through selling the enhanced edition items, since that would be unfair. I will just drop them on the ground after looting and showing their descriptions. And finally, as a result of our low strength values, our carrying capacity will be unimpressive, and we won't be able to hold as much weight as usual. The expensive bag of holding will not be a purchase of convenience for us, but a purchase of necessity. An investment we'll have to make somewhat early, I think, to be able to actually carry heavier items to sell. I will showcase some trade optimizations to earn as much gold as possible for the stuff we scavenge, but even then, we simply won't be able to afford certain items, or at least not as quickly as we normally would. I'm sure we'll have a lot of interesting decisions to make in terms of gold spending, tactics, managing our resources, and so on. All in all, with our difficulty measures in place, it should be a fun ride, and I can't wait to start playing. I can only hope it will be as entertaining for you as it will be for me. And finally, last quick remarks about the playthrough. I guess it should go here that we'll be playing a full 6-man party, which I find the most interesting and fun. I haven't stated it explicitly up until now, but it will be a normal run of the standard campaign and its expansions, Heart of Winter and Trials of the Lore Master. So not Heart of Fury mode, and also there will be a bit of role-playing in the run to spice things up here and there. It's not a key concept, so if you don't like RP, you need not worry. It won't play a major role, but I'll sometimes weave it in to give a reason for doing something, or to explain a choice, or to provide a bit more immersion. that kind of thing. Alright, now's the time for the real deal, the party segment. And it will require its own table of contents. This one is not for the faint of heart. I mean, I have to get into the juicy details somewhere, right? But in all seriousness, I don't want to skim past important elements related to the party and the characters themselves. I want to properly discuss the various decisions and ideas, especially since party creation is such an integral part of Icewind Dale. We don't just create a protagonist here, but a whole party, and the theory crafting and planning involved in that is just beautiful. So, let's enjoy this. First, we'll talk about my general approach to creating our group, what I wanted to include and accomplish designing it the way it is. Second, we'll have an attribute refresher, a quick recap of what each stat influences, and then finally I'll present all of the particular members of our party one by one. So, to start off our party creation explanation, let me first talk about a few goals I had in mind for our group. I wanted to include a variety of classes, races, and to some degree alignments as well. Not just for the sake of fun, although that too was important, but also because of more specific reasons related to our completionist philosophy, like showcasing as many unique dialogue options and quest outcomes as possible, or highlighting how different many classes are in Icewind Dale compared to their Baldur's Gate equivalents. As a result, we'll have a balanced, generalist party able to present a wide array of tactics and playstyles, and every character will conduct a number of conversations to allow us to explore many options there. Unfortunately, it is always the case that you can't have everything you want in just one party. Certain less significant types of characters just didn't make the cut. There were simply more important things to include instead. I wasn't able to fit in a gnome, for example. It's a very minor loss, though, as gnomes only have 2 unique short conversations I will display on screenshots, so no worries there. In general, I'll try to mention anything relevant we won't be able to directly engage in and cut to a screenshot of it. For instance, there's a few dialogue responses that specifically an evil cleric can give, and even though we won't have that kind of character, I'll definitely show those. Now, to touch on the suboptimal vibe in more detail. We've already talked about it in regards to how it will affect the difficulty, but there's another facet to it, that it will make the game more interesting and fun in many other ways. One of my favorite consequences of having imperfect characters is how a great amount of resources suddenly become more relevant and useful. There's a whole assortment of spells, consumables, and other items that gain a lot of value for unoptimized parties. Tools that would normally get quickly discarded or sold will actually be appreciated and helpful in our run. Along the same vein, going for bad weapon proficiencies, setting up some item restrictions, or simply not having enough strength to equip certain gear will rule out some commonly utilized equipment and instead unlock other options which usually don't see much use. Also, to make things clear and not give you the wrong idea, this design approach doesn't mean we'll have some clown world party of absolutely terrible characters with no redeeming traits. They will have some good parts to them, some things will make sense. It's just that they will be far from optimal and not what you would normally see. Now, before we delve deeper, I thought it would be a good idea to quickly remind ourselves of what each attribute influences. It's important to note that these effects can be either positive or negative, depending on the value. The bonuses usually start from around 15 and the penalties from around 5, but there are exceptions from that, and the progression of these changes isn't always linear. Also, most attributes play a role in conversations, affecting which dialogue options become available to use, or whether they are successful. Strength influences the damage and THAC0 of melee attacks, as well as the damage of thrown weapons and slings. It also determines carrying capacity and the effectiveness of opening locks by force. Furthermore, a lot of equipable items have some sort of a strength requirement. Dexterity affects armor class, THAC0 with ranged attacks, and thief skills. Nothing else. The reaction adjustment you often see in the tables is a stat from pen and paper and has never been implemented into any of the games. It just serves to confuse people with reaction, just reaction, which is a mechanic used in Baldur's Gate 1, influenced by charisma. Here, they claim it affects the speed factor of weapons, but it's easy to test and prove it does nothing. I guess it's just tradition at this point to have things wrong in the manuals. It's always been this way. Constitution governs the matters of hit points and how quickly a character becomes fatigued or drunk. It can also grant regeneration at high values. Intelligence is important primarily for mages and bards, affecting their chance to successfully scribe spells, determining how many spells can fit into their spellbooks, and what spell levels they can learn. It can also give a one-time bonus or penalty to lore for any class. A character needs at least 9 intelligence to be able to use wands and scrolls. Wisdom matters primarily to clerics and druids, granting additional spell memorization slots to them, and just like intelligence, it can provide a one-time bonus or penalty to lore. It's important to point out that wisdom doesn't give any additional memorization slots to warrior classes with access to divine spells like paladins or rangers. Finally, charisma allows for discounts when buying items from merchants and influences dialogue options the most out of all attributes. And a few last remarks before we examine our heroes in detail. You'll notice that we'll have almost exclusively single-class characters and that their total attribute points range from 70 to 78, with quite a few stats being at their minimum allowed values. In general, my advice to power gamers is to pretty much close your eyes here, be strong, and somehow we will get through this. I'll present each party member by first generally discussing their characteristics, then I'll provide a bit of role-playing info about them, and finally showcase how some min-maxed versions of that type of character could look like, or how I would suggest to design them. So first, let's talk about the leader of our party, the Paladin, known as Sir Rintar. When it comes to race and alignment, there's of course no choice here. It has to be a lawful good human. However, when it comes to the class itself, there's plenty to discuss. Icewind Dale has a lot of content involving paladins, and as such, it's a must-have for a completionist playthrough. The class receives some new abilities compared to Baldur's Gate, has a multitude of unique dialogue options across the game, and there's also a Holy Avenger sword to obtain, which only paladins can wield. Aside from the standard traits we know from Baldur's Gate, these Holy Knights in Icewind Dale are immune to disease and become immune to fear at level 3. Both are relevant, with a special nod towards disease, as quite a few creatures can apply it on hit. We also get 2 new abilities, Smite Evil and Cure Disease. The former is an instant magic attack, perfect for interrupting spellcasters. It only affects specifically evil creatures, which is fine, but the unfortunate thing about this ability is that we never get more uses of it, just once per rest. Now, Cure Disease is a handy tool to have as well. There are consumables that allow us to remove diseases, but it's nice to have another source of it, especially since the spell also heals for 5 HP. So it's an additional minor heal for the Paladin, besides Lay on Hands. One more thing to mention here is that the Paladin self-buff protection from evil is way better as well. It lasts for 24 turns, which is almost 5 hours of in-game time, and the protection from evil effect in Icewind Dale also grants an immunity to charm besides the usual bonuses. There's also a supposed increase to saving throws against evil sources, but I'm not sure if that's actually implemented. I have my doubts about it. Yet another difference is the Paladin's spell progression. The class gets earlier access to divine spells, already at level 6, as opposed to 9 in Baldur's Gate, but ends up getting less memorization slots in total, so it's a mixed deal. However, in general, most of the above changes make the Paladin a more resilient frontliner and a more interesting character to play. Now, when it comes to the Paladin I've made here, obviously his physical stats leave a lot to be desired and are worse than Branwen's from Baldur's Gate 1. Initially, I wanted him to be more of an agile combatant, in contrast to the usual strong and tough archetype we see in knights like Ajantis, Anomen, or Keldorn, but eventually I just brought down his stats low enough so that he doesn't get any bonuses from them. His low strength also renders him incapable of equipping large shields, even the magical ones, without any temporary boosts. And speaking of those, I've left his strength and dexterity high enough so that they can be a viable target for attribute increasing equipment and spells. Especially his draw upon Holy Might will be an important buff, to his melee performance and armor class, but not to his hit points. His constitution is at its minimum value and will always be too low to grant any bonuses there. Only a potion of fortitude will be able to enhance his HP. It will make those potions a powerful and valuable resource. His mental stats are not too important gameplay-wise, but again, I wanted him to be different in this area, actually having decent intelligence, which is of course the primary dump stat for paladins. As our party leader, he will conduct most of the conversations, and I wanted his stats to support that. By the way, it's safe to have a paladin in that role, as they don't refuse rewards like they do in Icewind Dale 2, so no need to plan for that. A slightly suboptimal aspect is his 17 charisma. It's the minimum for paladins, so he has no choice but to be almost at the max. Its limited significance is that early on in the game, we'll have to pay merchants a bit more compared to having a value of 18 there. Of course, later on, we'll use a different character, boosted by the Friends spell, to access maximum discounts, so eventually it won't matter anymore. There will also be an arbitrary gear restriction placed upon Rintar. He will be prohibited from wearing plate armors. This will make his armor class worse, furthering the suboptimal vibe, but it will also unlock the usage of some chain and splint mails that are normally outshined by plate armors. They also won't tax his carrying capacity as much, which will be a big concern for him and our entire party. Now, if there's any upside to this character, it's his proficiency choices. All of them are strong categories for one-handed weaponry. He starts out with 2 points in longswords, which will be his main focus. There's plenty of them in the game, with a nice power progression, and of course, the Holy Avengers in the Icewind Dale series are in the form of longswords. The allocation of his other proficiency points might look a bit weird, but there's a plan behind it. These one-pointers set him up to finish his specialization when relevant weaponry becomes available or when a certain type of damage is needed. He has 1 point in axes, which will serve mostly as his ranged option, with some exceptions. With a single point there, he can use throwing axes without penalties right from the beginning, and it's not important to have a bigger investment until later. The other point went into flails and morning stars, so that once he's level 3 and gets his next proficiency point, he can become specialized with them. And that will be precisely the time when we want to have access to reliable crushing damage, as we will be fighting against masses of skeletal undead resistant to other types of physical harm. Then, in Chapter 2 of the game's story, some prominent axes become available, and he will again have his specialization completed just in time by reaching level 6 at that point. With these 3 proficiency types maxed out, he will have all of his needs well covered, and further down the line, he'll be free to pick up something more extravagant. Now, as for his role-playing segment, seeing that it's the first one we'll go over, let me just mention that in general, with these notes, I wanted to add some flavor to our characters, describing certain aspects of their personality, what deity they worship, and why they came to Icewind Dale to begin with. So, not an extensive background, but I thought a few pertinent remarks would be cool. For Rintar, the matters of faith will be extremely relevant. They will provide a strong connection to the game's story, and will add a bit of weight to all of the Paladin's unique dialogue options that often mention his chosen god. He will be a worshipper of Tyr, the maimed god of justice. I like that choice on its own, but there are more layers to it. First off, Tyr is the leader of an alliance of 3 benevolent gods known as the Triad. It's a coalition between him, Torm, and Ilmater. Without going into spoilers, the plot of Icewind Dale strongly involves the clergy of Ilmater and some disturbances within their ranks. Knowing the close ties between the worshippers of Tyr and Ilmater, we can explain Rintar's presence in the 10 towns. News from the frozen north have reached the churches of Tyr across Faerun about the various troubles concerning the Ilmaterian priesthood in Icewind Dale. Reports of disappearances and kidnappings of Ilmater's faithful, as well as rumors pointing to a supposed emergence of an unknown new cult, twisting the doctrine of the broken god, greatly worried the followers of the Triad. Rintar's church in nearby Neverwinter decided to send him to investigate those claims and bring justice to all involved. His worship of Tyr will make him more invested into the events of the game in general, make a particular quest in Chapter 6 a matter of honor for him to complete, will cause a few conversations to make more sense, and will also play a minor role when we obtain the Holy Avenger and read its description. As you will see, Rintar will be a fitting wielder of the weapon. Now, when it comes to an already mentioned aspect of his character, he's not a typical paladin in a few ways. In terms of fighting style, he's not as strong as most other knights, and as you can see in the picture, he favors lighter armors that don't weigh him down as much and don't constrict his movements. That's a slightly more elaborate explanation on why he's not going to use plate armors, I guess. Also, I wanted his mental stats to be somewhat above average, to signify that he's not a black and white worldview type of guy. This also fits his worship from another angle, as Tyr's followers never enforce unjust laws. So the lawful part of his mandatory paladin alignment is not absolute. This will come into play in a certain situation. One area where he is a rather typical knight, though, is his choice of arms. Of course, as a type of holy warrior, he received training in different types of weaponry, but spent the most time practicing his technique with the long sword, a traditional, iconic paladin armament, which is reflected in his starting proficiency and will be his preferred type of weapon over the course of the entire run. Finally, a few words about the min-maxed, optimized version of this type of character. But let me just squeeze in a quick general remark about these segments beforehand. In order to properly explain everything and provide reasons for why I consider certain choices good or not, I will have to refer to some specifics and include very limited semi-spoilers. I even hesitate to call them that, because they will be intentionally somewhat on the vague side and mainly pertain to weapon availability when discussing proficiency types. You don't really have to worry about them, because a name of an item or spell with the chapter number it's located in won't tell you much of anything if you don't know the game already. Still, I wanted to give a heads up about it, just in case. Now, as for our paladin, of course it goes without saying that he would have his physical stats and charisma maxed out. The weapon proficiencies would be similar, as they are all strong and versatile one-hander options, but going into the Enhanced Edition territory, I'd like to mention the weapon styles. In my opinion, both sword and shield and dual wielding are very viable. The latter is obvious, especially with long swords and flails. There are not only great main hands, but also speed weapons in both groups. Speaking of which, you can get a fast flail +2 from a random drop in the original campaign, and in the expansion, there are 2 long swords of action +4, which would be fantastic offhands in Baldur's Gate 2, let alone in Icewind Dale. However, sword and shield style is something I'd like to stop by for a second. Here I value the armor class boost against missile attacks it gives, much more so than in Baldur's Gate. I mean, sure, there's an argument you can make for it in the first BG specifically, seeing how many of the earlier opponents are archers with a potential of being dangerous. Kobold commandos, hobgoblin elites, the human bandits, and later on, Black Talon elites, of course. So spending some points into it is certainly not a waste, but as soon as we go into Baldur's Gate 2, there's simply no justification for it. However, in Icewind Dale, it's drastically different. Dangerous or even lethal archers are present in great numbers all throughout the game. Basically, every chapter of the original campaign, from the prologue until the end, has notable ranged attackers to worry about. The situation changes in Heart of Winter, but generally, I'd consider points in sword and shield style to be well spent. Now, while we're still on the topic of armaments, let me make a quick pause to address something. In the min-max segments, we'll talk a lot about various one-hand and ranged weapons, but I won't really have a chance to analyze the two-handers anywhere. And since the paladin is the closest character we'll have to a typical melee fighter, most likely to wield a big two-handed weapon, let me share a few quick remarks about those. Going from the worst to best, I would say that at the bottom of the barrel we would find the quarterstaff and spear. They are not terrible, but both suffer from different issues, ultimately making them quite lackluster in general. Quarterstaves in Icewind Dale seem to have been made with the intention to be mage weapons. I generally get the impression with this game that it purposefully aims to strengthen many of the classic fantasy themes. And when viewing things from that perspective, the design of quarterstaves makes sense. However, the unfortunate consequence of it is that the category doesn't offer much to other classes. Many staves lag behind other weapons in their enchantment level, and they don't have any interesting on-hit properties either. What they do have in abundance is the amount of spells they provide, mostly arcane ones, which restricts those weapons to mages specifically. The powerful staff introduced by the Enhanced Edition is no exception either. Therefore, quarterstaves are more of a utility weapon to use spell charges from, but there are still a few decent magical sticks a fighter mage could utilize with some success in combat. And it is only that kind of class combo who should ever consider spending more proficiency points into this category. As an extremely minor aside, the arcane spell Decastave also takes the caster's proficiency points in quarterstaves into account. Even there, you can see that connection. Now, spears as a weapon type have much simpler shortcomings. There are a few decent examples in the game, but they simply aren't spread out too well. You are guaranteed to get some highly enchanted spears from adventuring, but only from Chapter 5 and later. There's also the Spear of White Ash, available for purchase in Kuldahar, but its price and design make it more of an early endgame item instead of something to bridge the gap between the start of the run and the acquisition of more powerful variants later on. We'll talk about the stark contrast between how spears and scimitars were handled in that regard during our third character's presentation. In any case, spears require some time to get going, especially since there are no early magical specimens. For instance, a simple spear +1 is only available in the expansion and nowhere to be found in the original campaign. Weapons of this type are also not interesting enough. They are either completely bland, or their on-hit effects have a far too low of a chance to trigger. There's a strange design choice to make all 3 spears with bonus on-hit damage always have only a 5% chance for it to occur. What is up with that? It's such a low probability, they might as well be considered plain, magically enchanted spears and nothing more. Suffice to say, this category should have been more thought out, especially since halberds and spears weren't originally combined together in one proficiency group like they were in classic Baldur's Gate 1, so they should be able to stand on their own. Contrary to staves and spears, the other two-handed armaments won't play a role in our playthrough at all, so I'll just briefly talk about them. Perhaps a tiny step above spears, but really reliant on random drops, are the two-handed axes. They are a bit of a novelty in Icewind Dale, a similar weapon to the halberd, but using the axe proficiency. There are a few cool examples of them in the game, but like I said, most are not guaranteed. The only magical two-handed axe available for purchase is the Lonesome Road in Kuldahar, but it's prohibitively expensive, and the only good static drop comes in Chapter 5. This category also lacks any kind of true ultimate weapon. And finally, going further up the hierarchy, on top of the list, we have the two-handed swords and halberds, both really solid options. They are plentiful, decently spread out, with a balance of random and static drops, and offering a variety of properties and on-hit effects. Not much to complain about here. Both are completely viable for a two-hander user. Lastly, since I won't have the chance to address bastard swords anywhere else, let's have a few thoughts about them now. They are the quintessential high-risk, high-reward type of weapon. Within this category, there's great quality, excellent main hands, a speed weapon, a lot of good stuff, but there's just one problem. Literally all of them are random drops. As far as reliable variants go, you can buy yourself a bastard sword +1 from Kuldahar, whoop-de-doo. There's also Troll Slayer available in the shop, but its name is the only cool thing about it, and it's not worth the asking price at all. Admittedly, there's one random loot pile with 3 bastard swords out of 4 total items, but only 2 of them could be considered a small upgrade over the generic +1 version. The overarching theme with this weapon type is that if you're unlucky, you can keep going and never get one. In the expansion, the situation gets only slightly better. There's a good static drop in Trials of the Lore Master, and a pretty expensive, specialized anti-undead sword available for purchase. Overall, I suppose this design might be somewhat excusable in this case, because in the original Icewind Dale, bastard swords belonged to the Great Sword proficiency group together with two-handed swords, so you'd have plenty of those to utilize, no matter how random drops treated you. However, in the Enhanced Edition, with the more separated categories, beware of this one. By the way, I feel I must mention that if you eliminate the randomness of drops by being willing to reload for them or by using a mod, Obviously, this type of downside will matter much less, and will elevate some weapon categories to a far better standing. However, I'm always describing them in the context of the default unmodified rules, so keep that in mind. And well, technically we also have katanas added by the Enhanced Edition. They are okay, I suppose. Rare, but dependable. You have to invest quite a bit of early money for a non-magical katana at the start, but then there is a +1, +2, and a +3 variant in the original campaign, one of each kind. 2 of them are static drops, and the last one is a very expensive endgame purchase. There are none in the expansion though, whether it's by design or because they forgot or something, I don't know. Not a great proficiency, but you won't end up empty-handed if you select it. Now, with that out of the way, let's get back to our optimized paladin. Most importantly for the min-maxing aspect, the Enhanced Edition introduces class kits, and among those we have the Undead Hunter. It's a very exciting topic to discuss in general, because Undead Hunter is one of those kits that really find its purpose in Icewind Dale, after a long time of being benched on the sidelines in Baldur's Gate. It's never been a bad class to play in those games, but it's not a popular choice either, and for good reason. The other paladin kits fit the conditions of Baldur's Gate much, much better. There are no prominent undead creatures in Baldur's Gate 1, and in the sequel, even though there are powerful opponents of that variety, like vampires or liches, there are also many tools specifically designed to battle them. Instant killing weapons, anti-undead spells, or the green scrolls of protection from undead. In those circumstances, the Undead Hunter is simply redundant, and clearly overshadowed by the Inquisitor, Cavalier, or Blackguard, all of whom bring relevant abilities in the spell-heavy environment of Baldur's Gate 2, or against enemies like dragons and fiends, who are not as easily countered as undead. It matters even more with SCS on board, where battles are won not by having a bit more damage, but rather by doing the right moves at the right times. And tactically, the other kits bring much more value to the table than the few passives our anti-undead specialist can offer. In Icewind Dale, however, the situation changes dramatically. Finally, the Undead Hunter can have his time in the spotlight and fit in perfectly. Almost too perfectly. It's truly a match made in heaven. But let's examine all the details. First off, Icewind Dale is infested with the undead. I've never made a precise calculation on it, but I feel like at least a quarter or 1/3 of the enemies in the game are such creatures. They are present in basically every chapter after the prologue, and there are quite a few parts of the game entirely dedicated to fighting against them. It's a menace. So, that +3 Thaco and damage bonus against undead will be active very often. And here it's a relevant boost, given how combat-oriented the game is, especially if you prioritize a physical fighting style. But that's just the beginning. As for the other properties, being protected from level drain is irrelevant in Icewind Dale, but the innate immunity to hold and paralyze certainly isn't. On the contrary, it is a huge perk. Not only are there creatures that apply those effects on hit, but also the most frequently used spells by enemy clerics are Hold Person and Dispel Magic. Being held while fighting monsters can be a death sentence to any frontline combatant, but with an Undead Hunter, having an undispellable protection against it, we don't have to worry about that kind of scenario at all. That's a considerable benefit, even when not fighting undead. And to make things even better, the Undead Hunter doesn't lose much of the basic Paladin toolkit either, just Lay on Hands and Cure Disease. All of the other abilities, or access to divine spells, remain intact. It's simply a fantastic deal. Now, let's move on to our next character, the Cleric, Galburin. He's the dwarf in our party, because dwarves are cool, and every party needs one. He'll show us some fitting dwarven dialogue options from time to time, and speaking more from a stats perspective, with his constitution value, he will enjoy a +4 bonus to his saves versus spell, death, and wand, being one of the shorty races. His alignment of lawful neutral is of great significance, both from a role-playing standpoint, which I'll elaborate on in his RP segment, but also because of gameplay consequences. In Icewind Dale, alignment influences the cleric's selection of available spells to a great extent, going far beyond the situation we know from Baldur's Gate, where the only spells involved were Holy Smite and Holy Word, and their counterparts, Unholy Blight and Unholy Word. Here, the ramifications of being a good, neutral, or evil cleric are the main highlight of the class, and what sets it apart. There are 3 distinct spell arsenals for clerics, depending on their alignment. Of course, a lot of spells will be available to all of them, but there's a few examples of spells exclusive to good or evil clerics, and many that are only castable by non-good or non-evil ones. The good spells usually focus on healing and protecting allies, while the evil ones are mostly about dealing damage or debuffing enemies. A neutral cleric has access to tools from both areas, but without the highest echelon of the most powerful spells from each group. And I thought this spell selection would be the most interesting to showcase in a completionist playthrough, hence the neutral alignment on our cleric. He will be able to provide us with a diverse assortment of spells that will prove useful in many situations. It also has to be mentioned that there are a few spells where the cleric's alignment will dictate whom they will affect and how. Spells like Righteous Wrath of the Faithful and Spiritual Wrath take the alignments of the cleric and his potential targets into account to determine the effect. We'll of course discuss the details during the playthrough, but this is yet another small way of making ourselves less optimal, as our party will not be a monolith in terms of alignment, and that will make some spells less effective or more dangerous to use. Also, being lawful, Galburin won't be able to cast the spell Blood Rage, but it's okay, as there's a very similar spell, Animal Rage, which we can use to show the concept of a Berserk-type buff. Finally, a quick remark about the divine magic in general. I just want to point out that the spell arsenals of clerics and druids are more unique in Icewind Dale, with less overlap between the two. There are more spells that belong only to one or the other. To give a few examples, spells like Barkskin or Firestorm are only available to druids, while Defensive Harmony or Chaotic Commands are exclusive to clerics. This also reinforces the classic themes for those spellcasters, with clerics focusing more on buffs and protections, and druids having more access to damaging and summoning spells. Besides magic, Galburin's alignment will matter in 2 more areas for us. First, the unique cleric dialogue options are separated by alignment. I've already mentioned that there are a few cool evil cleric responses I'll show on screenshots, so all is good there. And lastly, I have to draw attention to the fact that both our frontliners capable of using shields, the paladin and cleric here, are lawful aligned, which is not good planning. There's a notable shield in Chapter 2 with a 50% chance to drop that's unusable by lawful characters. Under normal circumstances, I would avoid that type of thing like the Plague, but I really wanted our cleric to be lawful for role-playing reasons, and in this playthrough, even if we get that shield, it might actually be a good thing, since we are looking for ways to make ourselves less powerful, as per the suboptimal vibe. So I will not be bothered by it. Now, when it comes to attributes, it will usually be the case that they will reflect both the character's race and their role-playing background, and here it's no different. As a dwarf, I wanted him to have a decent constitution without going the optimal route, and I wanted his dexterity to be a weakness. He's an example of that strong and tough archetype that lacks in agility. With 15 strength, he will be our strongest party member. This base value doesn't give him any bonuses, but with clerical self-buffs, we will be able to temporarily improve his battle performance here and there. Of course, being a single-class cleric, he's always going to be lacking in that area, but that's the idea. He's not meant to be a great combatant. His dexterity is low enough to actually give him a -1 penalty to his armor class and ranged THAC0, and 15 constitution means he will have a +1 bonus to his HP per level. He has enough intelligence to use wands and scrolls, and I allowed our divine spellcasters to have high wisdom, because having more spells means more fun and more opportunities to showcase the divine magic of this game. His proficiencies are pretty standard. Warhammers are the classic cleric weapon, reflected in the game by having the most sanctified variants, granting bonus spell memorization slots, and slings are the typical ranged option for a character like him. Now, as for some role-playing remarks, I have quite a few to share, and we'll talk about a lot of things kind of together. Galburin is a cleric of Gorm Golthin, the god of vigilance and defense from the dwarven pantheon, a guardian and protector figure for the stout folk. His priests are known as Barakor, or those who shield, and are subject to a strict code of honor and are unwavering in their commitment to protect dwarven kind. This is why his lawful neutral alignment is so important. He has a sworn moral code he abides by and enjoys being a part of a structured environment with a clear set of rules and responsibilities. As a devout follower of Gorm, he performs his duties with the utmost dedication and considers being a guardian his calling in life. He is an old shield dwarf, a common type in the north of Faerun, exhibiting the classic traits of being gruff and taciturn. He's a grumpy old man, basically, which is reflected by his low charisma. He might not give off the best first impression, but despite his grim disposition, his heart is in the right place, and once he warms up to a person, he's a loyal friend and a stalwart companion who would sacrifice himself for the well-being of others. Now, in regards to why he came to Icewind Dale and recruited himself into our group, it's because of a traumatic event from his past. He doesn't divulge the details, and all that's known is that tragedy befell his clan. Despite his best efforts, he wasn't able to prevent its destruction. As one of the few survivors, he believes he failed in his sacred duty as a guardian, failed his god and his kin. It was a turning point that made him into a wanderer, now striving to atone for his past failure by seeking other dwarf clanholds in peril, to rekindle his connection to Gorm and fulfill the role of a protector once again. In his travels, he heard rumors of an ancient dwarven fortress embroiled in conflict somewhere within Icewind Dale, and so he set out for the frozen north to begin his search. I am such a dork, dude. Anyway, as for what min-maxed versions of this character would look like, there's a few options. The strongest would be a dual class or multi-class, but let's talk about some kits first, in case you wanted to stay a single class cleric or begin as a cleric in a dual class. I'd like to highlight the Priests of Lathander and Talos here. The former would probably be the best single class cleric, as Boon of Lathander is a nice buff and it stacks with itself. So eventually, when you have more uses of it, you can either spread their usage around to have it up more often, or you can stack them for a powerful boost for one important battle. The Priest of Lathander can also cast Hold Undead as an innate ability, which comes in handy very often, considering the prevalence of undead in this game. Now, Priest of Talos mainly has Storm Shield to offer. It can be really powerful for a variety of uses, both against the dangerous archers Icewind Dale has in store and in spell combos. This is why an unorthodox but decent dual class idea is to start out as one and transition into a fighter after a few levels. This would make the character a good warrior with access to Storm Shield and a few low-level cleric spells. More interesting and more powerful than a plain fighter, at the expense of some fighter HP from the first couple of levels. When it comes to the usual dual class design though, of course starting as a berserker and going into cleric would be the preferred choice. I'm generally a proponent of early dual classing, so for Icewind Dale, I like 3 levels of a fighter before switching to a different class, with some exceptions I'll cover later. A level 3 dual class in a full 6-man group is started and finished during the Veil of Shadows, so you can complete the character already in Chapter 1 and have the whole rest of the game pain-free in that regard. From those 3 levels we get some fighter HP, a 3rd proficiency point into our weapon of choice, and access to Grand Mastery further down the line. And it has to be mentioned that Grand Mastery in Icewind Dale is better than in Baldur's Gate, as the final proficiency point gives a whole another attack per round instead of just half. And naturally, being a berserker in this case, grants the powerful Enrage ability with basically no downside. A multi-class of course gives up access to Grand Mastery and the fast level and spell progression for the cleric, but opens up the possibility to use races other than human and enjoy their benefits. So half-orc, for example, with maxed out stats, is a pretty strong choice. Also, a special mention has to be made about the Ranger Cleric multiclass. Having access to both Druid and Cleric spells naturally makes it powerful and versatile. When it comes to attributes, I don't want to keep stating the obvious to max them out, but one niche thing to mention is that even though single-class clerics don't receive HP benefits above 16 Constitution, it's still worth to go up to 18 for the shorty races to get the +5 bonus to saves. And of course for dual and multi-classes with some sort of warrior class in there, the usual Constitution benefits will apply. As for proficiencies, the selection is of course limited by the Cleric's weapon ethos, even if you mix the class with others, by dual or multiclassing. From the available options, the only contenders for reaching Grand Mastery are Warhammers and Flail's Morningstars. Both groups provide plenty of good weapons, but Warhammers are more focused on granting bonus memorization slots, whereas Flails have the advantage of having a speed weapon, the Fast Flail, in its ranks. Although it's a random drop, that's a speed weapon usable by Clerics. A big difference compared to Baldur's Gate. Maces are a clear step down from the previous options, their main drawback being very low numbers. There's only a few of them in the entire game. Granted, you can buy the decent Love of Black Bess in Kaldahar, but other than that, there's nothing interesting out there. Besides the generic Mace +1, there are literally 2 other magical maces in the original campaign, and to make matters funnier, they are included in the same random drop pile. Not only are they both unimpressive, one of them is unusable by lawful characters, and because they are a part of the same loot table, you can only get one or the other. Not to mention, there are much better weapons in that pile, most importantly the Fast Flail, but also a good Warhammer and club. All of these deficiencies are presumably caused by the fact that, in the original Icewind Dale proficiency system, maces were put together with Morningstars in the same group, and it was flails that were separated into their own category. That would explain a lot. All that being said though, it's still worth to consider putting some points into maces later on, especially for characters without access to Grand Mastery, solely for a notable anti-undead armament in the expansion, the 3 White Doves. If you buy it early in Heart of Winter, you can get quite a lot of value from it. Clubs aren't too impressive and will be covered in the next characters segment, and when it comes to the Cleric's ranged weaponry, slings are the only option, so not much to consider there. As for weapon styles, it's a similar case to the Paladins. Sword and shield style is viable, and dual wielding is insanely good in Icewind Dale, especially if you're determined to get that Fast Flail for your offhand. Now, since we talked about how important alignment is for the Cleric, I'd also like to provide a more general remark about optimizing alignments for other classes that allow some choice there. It's not nearly as impactful, but it does influence quite a few gear choices. It's best to remain neutral, both on the good versus evil axis, as well as the law versus chaos one. This is due to the fact that there are only a few items reserved for good or evil characters, and they aren't a big deal at all. On the other hand, there's plenty of equipment restricted from good or evil, and a few cases where lawful is an obstacle too. In other words, neutral characters will have the widest selection of available gear by far. Just something to keep in mind. Our third party member will be a Druid by the name of Asathi. I've already mentioned how much better the Druid is here compared to its Baldur's Gate counterpart, and as such, it is an essential component of my parties. Whenever I play Icewind Dale, I jump at the opportunity to include a Druid, and pretty much always have one. So, let's do a rundown of all of the improvements. First off, the Druid's spell selection is massively upgraded, right from level 1. We'll explore all of the details as we go through the game, but long story short, it's a terrific improvement. Secondly, the shapeshifting is much better. There are more available forms, they are more unique, and are gradually unlocked, already from level 5. What makes it even sweeter is the fact that each shapeshift heals you for 12 HP, so even if you don't need or don't want to engage in that mechanic, or when you outscale the forms, especially as a fighter druid, dual or multi-class, it can still serve as a source of self-healing, giving the character more longevity and staying power between rests. Next up, the poison immunity comes faster, at level 9 instead of 15, and there's a new immunity to fatigue at level 15 instead. Another thing, more linear level progression, without the huge gap between level 14 and 15 known from Baldur's Gate. And finally, even though it's not an inherent part of the class itself, there's interesting content for druids in Icewind Dale. Quite a few unique conversations, with some that allow for additional experience, as well as druid-specific gear, or generalist items that fit the class very well. It just makes sense to have a druid, both from a gameplay and a role-playing standpoint too. Now on the flip side, there are two negative changes compared to Baldur's Gate, one relevant and one that basically doesn't matter. Starting from the latter, the druid doesn't develop a natural resistance to fire, cold, and electricity in batches of 10%, at levels 18, 21, and 24. It doesn't play much of a role in Icewind Dale, as you only get up to around level 20 in a normal playthrough, but even if you did go higher, that's an extremely minor element of the class. What isn't so minor is that druids don't have access to iron skins in this game. I mean, they do in the Enhanced Edition, as it brings that spell here, with a massively improved cast time to boot, but it wasn't available in the original Icewind Dale, and so I won't be using it in accordance with our Purist philosophy. All in all, I love the Druid in Icewind Dale, and we will have a fun time playing the class in the run. I'll do my best to engage in all of its mechanics, and in so doing, Asathi here will fulfill a true hybrid role in combat. She will be somewhat capable in melee when utilizing the Druid weapon spells. She'll be able to use ranged attacks, making use of a variety of darts. She'll cast direct damage or summoning spells, and will shapeshift into different forms too. She will be a versatile asset to our group. Now, to analyze the other aspects of her character, Icewind Dale allows elves to be druids, so I took advantage of that opportunity. It's mostly to show a few cool conversations, because her racial properties related to gameplay won't really matter for us. Her physical stats are abysmal, so the theoretical 19 dexterity or 17 constitution are a thing of dreams for her. She can't use swords or bows, and there's not a lot of charm and sleep effects flying around in the game. So it's mostly for that RP value, man. I've allowed her to have 18 wisdom, so that we can enjoy her druidic magics to the maximum extent, especially after suffering through the low-level options we had in Baldur's Gate 1. But as an additional weakness, she doesn't have enough intelligence to use scrolls or wands. She starts out with clubs and darts as her proficiencies, mainly for role-playing reasons, which I'll elaborate on in a moment. Gameplay-wise, darts will enable us to make use of this type of ammo, and as a distance weapon with a shorter range, they will fit Asathi's hybrid role in combat. Clubs to start out with are okay, since proficiency points in them are used by an early weapon spell, and at the same time they give her a crushing damage option right from the get-go. There are also a few potential random drops we might be able to get. Eventually, she will pick up spears, and once we obtain some of their magical versions later on in the game, I'll try to make an effort to somewhat focus on them, just to have someone wielding two-handed weapons for a change. In general, both clubs and spears are average categories at best, which is appropriate for our suboptimal approach. And to further add to it, we will have a serious armor restriction for Asathi as well. She will only wear what we create from animal pelts and resources we gather ourselves. This will serve to weaken her armor class and make it more dangerous to face enemies in close quarters, but also give us a reason to make use of some underutilized crafted equipment that otherwise would end up getting sold or wouldn't get created in the first place. There will also be a justification for it in the RP segment. And actually, let's get into that role-playing part already. Asathi is a wild elf, and they are quite different from most of their cousins. As the name correctly implies, they are more feral and savage than other kinds of elves. They are a reclusive race, inhabiting forests far away from civilization. Organized in tribes and living in tune with nature, they generally keep to themselves and their animal companions, but some become more adventurous and travel outside of their communities. Wild elves are unique in terms of appearances too. They have brown skin and dark hair, and they also don't like to wear much clothing. They often pursue the path of the ranger, druid, shaman, or sorcerer, relying on their innate talents and an inherent affinity for the spiritual or the arcane, rather than education, especially since they are rarely ever literate. They craft their own tools and weapons from the available woodland materials, and even though they are on the crude or primitive side, they can be just as effective as the more refined equivalents made from metal. All of the above will relate to Asathi in some way. Even though she is physically frail, she feels a strong bond with nature, signified by her 18 wisdom, allowing her to often call upon the powers of the wilderness. Her intelligence is meant to show that she is not literate, and is not a scholarly type of person, instead relying on her intuitions, senses, and innate talents. She doesn't like to overburden herself with heavy clothing, and is distrustful of items from outside sources, especially with metallic elements. This will be reflected in that armor restriction we've talked about, and in her starting proficiencies. She will employ a more savage and ferocious style of fighting in melee, favoring the spell Beast Claw, which you can even see in her picture, or something meant to resemble that. Not having had a chance to see much of the world outside of the misty forest she originates from, she will be unfamiliar with its inventions, and only later slowly become convinced to try out other tools. Asathi worships Miliki, whom she feels a particular attunement to. Known as the Lady of the Forest, she's a goddess of, well, forests and forest creatures, and is a patron of druids and rangers. A fierce protector of wildlife, closely associated with unicorns, even having one on her holy symbol. Miliki is a very close ally to Sylvanus, the god of nature, and Eldath, a pacifist goddess of peace, serenity, and calm waters. Even though they're not directly related, they are like a family, with Sylvanus being the father figure for the two goddesses, who are in turn like sisters to each other. And by extension, the followers of those deities maintain close ties to one another as well. All of this will be relevant over the course of our playthrough, as well as now, to explain Asathi's journey to Icewind Dale. She has always let nature be her guiding hand in life, trusting signs and premonitions, and it is no different this time. Recently, she has been troubled by an ominous, recurring dream. Each night, she sees a foreboding, snow-covered landscape, ravaged by freezing winds. It seems impossible, but somewhere within, seemingly through a miracle of nature, grows a majestic tree, tall beyond measure, with branches stretching out across the sky. The sight of grassy fields and wildlife surrounding it fills Asathi with a brief feeling of wonder and tranquility, but such emotions quickly give way to a growing sense of dread and despair as she realizes the tree is slowly withering, being consumed by encroaching darkness all around it. Distraught, unable to sleep, and unsure of what to make of all this, she turned to her tribe's elders, hoping to gain clarity through their wisdom. They immediately recognized the place she described and concluded that her visions undoubtedly point to a sacred grove of Sylvanus, located in a northern land called Icewind Dale. The shrine has been a place of reverence since time immemorial, tended to by generations of druids, and protected by the magical warmth of the fabled Great Oak, an ancient tree dating back to the early days of Faerun itself. And if the oak was indeed in danger, Asathi and her tribe would not sit idly by. After some deliberation, it was decided. Trusting in her senses to find the way, Asathi was chosen to make a pilgrimage to find the holy site, protect the tree, and look for nature's signs for further guidance. Now, when it comes to making an optimized character of this sort, in my mind, dual class from a type of fighter is by far the best option, for a number of usual reasons, as well as that the expected incentives for other routes of development don't play a role here. Chief among those is the simple fact that the druid kits don't really stack up to the base class in Icewind Dale and lose a lot of its toolkit without granting anything impressive in return. A great example here is the Avenger. The additional spells and shapeshifts don't make nearly as much of a difference as they do in Baldur's Gate, because in this game the standard druid is already very capable in those areas, and they don't need fixing. A notable thing to mention, though, is that the spirit animals of the totemic druid eventually become immune to non-magical weapons at level 10, which is worth something, but as with the other kits, it's just not enough in my opinion. Also, going human for the dual class isn't a difficult trade-off either, as the only other available races are elf and half-elf, that don't offer much to a druid. Now on the flip side, the advantages of dual classing are immense. Druid lends itself well to that kind of thing because of how fast they level up until about level 12. That unlocks the possibility of higher level duels that you can still complete relatively quickly. That's why for the Druid dual classes, I often like to go up to level 7 in Fighter, to get more HP, additional proficiencies, and that half of an attack per round that all warrior classes get at level 7. Of course, depending on preference, it's always viable to do a standard duel at level 3, But in this example, let's discuss the level 7 variant. To give you a nice comparison, in order to attain level 8 in your second class and finish the dueling process, the Druid only needs 60,000 experience. For a Mage, that's 90,000, and for a Cleric, it's 110,000, almost twice as much. In full party runs, depending on how diligent you are with obtaining all the experience, this dual class is finished shortly before Chapter 3 or right after starting it. So there's still a lot of the game to play with that completed character. And to list its merits, you'll have a physical damage beast capable of dual-wielding scimitars with Grand Mastery, you'll have shape-shifting forms available for utility or self-healing, and a great assortment of spells, both offensive and protective. Speaking of scimitars, they are far and away the best choice out of the Druid's options, and a good category for one-handers in general. You can buy the cheap and solid Lucky Scimitar early on in Kuldahar, and eventually get 2 more guaranteed drops, Frostbrand in Chapter 5, and then Valiant, the speed weapon, in Chapter 6. A decent and reliable arsenal in the original campaign, especially for 2-weapon style, albeit a bit slow to develop after the beginning. If you remember my rant about spears, you'll see that here, despite having a similar issue of magical drops being stacked near the end, the solution is much better. The affordable Lucky Scimitar is the key to that problem, and easily holds out as a weapon until those later items show up. Moving forward to the expansion, for your ultimate main hand, you can craft yourself the Black Ice Scimitar in Gloomfrost, or get the one from Trials of the Lore Master, both being decent +4 enchanted armaments. And by the way, for classes that are not limited to just scimitars like the Druid, the Enhanced Edition added plain +1 Wakizashis and Ninjatos, but only in the expansion. So in other words, they do absolutely nothing to improve this proficiency type. The other contender, clubs, aren't a great choice for a Grand Mastery commitment, because most of the magical clubs are random drops or are available later in Heart of Winter. The only reliable options are the Spider Crusher of Doom from Kuldahar, but it's far too expensive for what it offers, and the +5 club from the Burial Isle in the expansion. Finally, there are also daggers to consider. An interesting choice, but I'm not a big proponent of advancing them to Grand Mastery as your main weapon type either. Their advantages are that they are plentiful and could also fill the role of a ranged option. However, there's a lot of randomness involved in getting some decent ones, and even then, they simply aren't too impressive for direct toe-to-toe combat. There are also quite a few daggers granting spell benefits for mages specifically, restricting some of the selection. Now, I hear some of you BG1 enthusiasts saying, "Wait, Miv, what about the Dagger of Venom? Icewind Dale basically has 2 of them." Well, that is correct, but their usefulness is greatly diminished in Icewind Dale because of 2 reasons. First, there aren't nearly as many spellcasters here, and second, because of just how many creatures are immune to poison in general. Thus, neither the spell interruption potential nor the raw damage over time end up being relevant too often. And whenever a good opportunity does present itself, you don't have to be fully committed to daggers to take advantage of their poisoning capabilities. Both clubs and daggers I prefer more as a secondary choice, or on characters only able to reach specialization, to grant them a crushing damage option or a ranged and poisoning option respectively. Finally, just as a general reminder, I've mentioned those weapon types specifically because, just like in the Cleric's example, even in a dual or multi-class scenario, we have to abide by the Druid's weapon ethos, limiting the available selection. But moving right along, the starter class for this type of character is optimally the Berserker because of Enrage and full gear access. But in case you're a bit of a masochist and love the Kensai like I do, then there are a few crucial factors to take into consideration. There's a handful of serious disadvantages that have no workaround. First off, the default coding in the Enhanced Edition of Icewind Dale is that thrown weapons cannot be used by a Kensai. So you can't just stand in the back, throwing some daggers and being safe, like you could in Baldur's Gate. Also, there are some nice armors and gloves you won't be able to wear, and there's no trick to overcome that with this class combo. However, there is one piece of headwear that a Kensai can equip, Sune's Laurel of Favor from Chapter 3, which does protect against critical hits. And of course, eventually, the safety concerns of a Kensai will fade away with access to spells like Iron Skins or Entropy Shield. Before unlocking them, however, there will be pain. Oh yes. Because early on, there's no convenient way to boost a Kensai's armor class. Barkskin is not great, especially on low levels. Ghost Armor, even though it's castable on others in Icewind Dale, is only a random drop in Chapter 1, and the only static drop is at the end of Chapter 2. And finally, the shield spell we remember so fondly from Baldur's Gate 1 will not be our savior this time. Items that cast or provide the shield effect, like the Wand of Armory or the Shield Ring, are only usable by arcane casters, so the Kensai Druid is out of luck here as well. But in the end, the suffering will be rewarded, and you'll have a class with 5 attacks per round that can slap on some cast time 1 Iron Skins that Jaheira wishes she had in Baldur's Gate 2, and become a killing machine with a cool arsenal of spells to boot. One last thing to mention is the traditional hurdle of optimizing the attributes for a dual class combo like this, because you need to have at least 15 strength to duel out of a fighter, and becoming a druid requires 17 in both wisdom and charisma. That doesn't leave a lot of expendable stats to dump, as all of them provide at least some value. So, short of getting a really high roll of way above 90, there will have to be some sacrifices. Intelligence is reasonable to drop, as there are only a few druid scrolls, and all the wands that druids can use are also available to either clerics or mages, so you can cover for that with other party members. There are also no mind flayers in Icewind Dale, so extremely low intelligence carries no other downsides. Another thing to consider is that you can go down in dexterity to as low as 6 to not incur any armor class penalties and free up a lot of points in the process, knowing that later on, spell buffs will keep you safe. For strength, it's okay to leave it at 15, because eventually there are gloves and a belt that set its value higher, and before acquiring those, one can use spells and consumables to increase it temporarily. However, going up to 18, even with a bad exceptional strength value, is nice, because there are a few items that improve strength by 1, making it possible to jump nicely to 19 that way. One of such items is a very easy to reload for random drop ring in Chapter 3, that the druids can always use because of their alignment. Speaking of which, just to be sure, remember to have it set to true neutral, to avoid making a mistake there and not lock yourself out of the option to become a druid in the first place. Alright, now it's time for a more straightforward character, our halfling fighter thief, Bray. With her combo of classes, race, and attributes, she will handle a few conversations, will provide the usual thief utility, and will be our main physical damage dealer, primarily as an archer, but will be capable of showing us some backstabs later on too. Being multiclassed, she will be able to use a cool pair of gloves, even though she won't utilize them to their full extent. And that's generally the thing with her. There will be many suboptimal elements to tone down her performance. Before we get to that though, I just want to mention that in Icewind Dale, thieves get evasion at level 7. It's not as useful as it is in Icewind Dale 2, where it's designed a bit differently, but it still counts for something. It allows thieves to occasionally avoid spells entirely, through an additional save versus breath they roll first, before the usual save versus spell happens. Unfortunately, the game doesn't provide a list of spells that can be evaded this way, but fear not, I shall deliver it and display it on the screen. I gotcha, my dudes. It depends on the edition of D&D, but traditionally, evasion allows characters to dodge out of certain area of effect spells, or later, area effects in general. Primarily those that inflict damage, and allow a saving throw to reduce it by half. However, as you can see, there are exceptions to that here. We have single target spells like Ice Lance, non-damaging casts like Color Spray, and even some special abilities exclusive to our enemies. There are also some issues with consistency, but not worth overanalyzing. Anyway, the problem with evasion is that it uses save versus breath, which is a thief's weakest save by far, lagging behind other saving throws by a value of 3 or 4, and there aren't any spectacular items, like the Belt of Inertial Barrier from Baldur's Gate, for example, that would give it a significant boost. It's a shame, because in effect, evasion is not reliable enough to use it as an element of our own strategies, and it won't occur naturally too often either. This is because opponents in Icewind Dale rarely cast the eligible spells, and when it comes to Bray specifically, as a ranged character, she will mostly stay away from trouble and shouldn't be getting hit by such effects in the first place. However, despite all the negatives, it's of course better to have it than not, and I think I will make an effort to stack a few items on our little thief and include evasion as a part of a tactic somewhere. We'll see. And one last remark about roguish mechanics. There's a possibility to toggle sneak attacks, known from the 3rd edition of D&D, instead of backstabs, but I will keep that disabled and maintain the default behavior in that area. Now, a lot of Bray's characteristics will have a more role-playing oriented reasoning, which I'll cover in more depth in the RP segment. However, I can't help but mention some of it even here. Like in most cases, I wanted her physical attributes to reflect her race and class combination. Having received some fighter training and being a nimble halfling, her strength and dexterity are decently high, especially the latter, providing her with a +2 boost to armor class and a +1 bonus to ranged THAC0. She's not very tough, but her constitution still gives her a +2 bonus to her saves versus spell, death, and wand, since being a shorty race is nice like that. Her mental stats will have a much larger justification from a role-playing perspective, but gameplay-wise, they are set up this way so that she can conduct a few specific dialogues. Her proficiency choices are her biggest weakness. Shortbows are the most disappointing ranged weapon in the whole game, especially when contrasted with their bigger brothers, the longbows. I will explain more about the launchers in the min-maxing part, but here let me just say that the best shortbow in the entire original campaign is the shortbow +1. Yep, there's nothing better than that until the expansion, where there's a grand total of 2 other shortbows. I don't know what the developers had against this weapon, but that's the worst selection out of any proficiency type in the game. The only redeeming quality of shortbows is that they can still be loaded up with good arrows, once we invest in them, because generally, as you will see, the ammo availability in Icewind Dale isn't quite what we are used to from Baldur's Gate. Short swords, on the other hand, are quite common, and they do have some variety to them, but the guaranteed drops are pretty unimpressive, while the better ones are typically included in rather big random drop piles and cannot be counted on. In time, she will learn to use maces to give her a crushing damage option and to make use of a specialized weapon in Heart of Winter. Bray is a Lightfoot halfling, the type known for their wanderlust, curiosity, and taste for adventure, and she will fit that profile very well. Her alignment is chaotic good because she's well-intentioned and good-hearted, but as a mischievous thief, the laws of the land are merely a suggestion for her, and she definitely doesn't mind tricking or stealing from whom she considers undeserving. Her mental stats help describe her as a smart and likable gal, but one who lacks in judgment. She can be hot-tempered and feisty, especially in defense of her friends. She's likely to jump into the fray without thinking of the consequences. Being both reckless and curious will prove to be a dangerous combination and will get her in trouble a few times. I have some ideas for that. I don't want to spoil too much, so I'll just say, cursed items, you heard of them? They sure can be tempting. Also, with her kind of temperament, I think she'll be the person to handle explosive potions and other such gadgets. Finally, her favored weapons fit her well, I think, both as a halfling and a thief. She's not made to wield giant, cumbersome weapons, preferring the smaller and stealthier types of tools instead. Bray doesn't worship any gods, even though Lightfoot halflings, often living alongside other races and cultures, are likely to become followers of foreign, non-halfling deities. And she's learned about the doctrines of many, but has never understood the appeal of organized faith. She is not the type of person for religious discipline, being too carefree and focused on the present to be confined by strict rules or godly demands. She would rather make light of people bound by serious moral codes and set rituals, and about how silly it all is to her. She doesn't have any grand motivation for arriving in Icewind Dale, other than her ever-present desire to explore faraway lands and to follow her adventurous spirit. You could say that her wanderlust brought her literally to the ends of the world, and she looks forward to seeing what new experiences these frozen landscapes will have in store for her. She will seize the day as she's always had. In her min-max segment, I'll focus on covering this particular type of fighter thief, because to do a thorough analysis of all the different thief permutations, it would take a whole separate video. Perhaps in the future I'll have an opportunity to present and talk about some other variations, but for now, let's go over this archer sort of multiclass. And there's a lot to consider, even in just this combo. The typical problem with thieves is that continuing their level progression brings limited benefits, so slowing it down in order to gain other advantages is preferable. And it's no different in Icewind Dale. There's really not much to put the skill points into. The requirements for lockpicking and disarming traps start out at low values and increase slowly. Plus, the game is linear, so you can't skip to some valuable, heavily trapped and locked containers early on. Skills like Detect Illusion have almost no practical application, and increasing the backstab multiplier for a ranged attacker is not as important as having reliable, consistent damage in a game where battling hordes of monsters is the norm. Of course, backstab is always handy to have access to, but lower on the list of priorities for this type of character. Therefore, pumping up stealth, especially when it can be replaced with invisibility for all intents and purposes, is not worth the point investment either. That leaves setting traps as the skill to focus on, for they are as powerful, or broken, as always. You can abuse them in many scenarios, especially in Chapter 3, where a lot of ambushes happen. By simply putting them on enemy spawn points, you can wipe them out as soon as they appear. Setting a trap for the trappers, a classic use of this skill. Not to mention all the situations where opponents don't start out as hostile and only attack later when certain conditions are met. The sky is the limit with trap creativity, but be careful not to ruin the game for yourself, because even when approached with a power gaming attitude, traps certainly have the potential to spoil the fun. All races except humans support the Fighter-Thief multiclass, but focusing on the archery here, there are two main contenders at first glance: elves and halflings. Both have access to a natural 19 dexterity, which grants an additional ranged Thaco boost compared to 18, but elves get yet another increase in that department when using bows. They will have less HP due to 17 constitution, but don't lose out on any strength, being able to easily roll for a great exceptional strength value, having in mind that this class only needs physical stats anyway. It's not a primary concern for an archer, but going into melee will sometimes be necessary, so it's good to be prepared for that eventuality. Halflings, on the other hand, get a Thaco bonus to slings, and they are limited to 17 strength. Of course, the shorty saves and 18 constitution are nice, but perhaps not to the same degree, depending on your priorities. Now, none of these puny concerns matter in the slightest when we turn our gaze to the half-orc. Even though it might not be the intuitive choice for an archer, you can maximize all physical attributes with it, having a natural 19 in strength and constitution, and getting access to 19 dexterity as well, through the usage of many +1 dexterity items the game provides. So you can kind of have your cake and eat it too. A different way to summarize it would be to classify the elf as the most offensive ranged attacker right from the beginning, the halfling being a more defensive option, and the half-orc dominating as an all-around physical powerhouse. All of them are viable in their own ways. Now, let's talk about those ranged weapons. Here we will have an undisputed winner. Starting from the worst though, as I've already mentioned, shortbows are a disgrace. And it's basically a criminal act to knowingly have a shortbow user instead of a longbow one. Thrown weapons are generally okay, but unimpressive. Daggers and axes are very basic, and only available in non-magical quality, with the sole exception of the returning axe +2 and a magical thrown dagger literally in the last room of the expansion before the final boss fight, but at least they get a bonus to damage from strength. If only the Enhanced Edition implemented the item upgrade mod in its entirety, we would at least have a purchasable boomerang dagger +1, but alas. Darts are more interesting, as there are many magical types of them, but the problem is that most are in very limited quantities and somewhat dependent on random drops. Slings are a traditionally solid option, having some magically enchanted variants with reasonable power progression, but ammo availability and diversity is a downside. A step above we have crossbows. Now we're getting into a more serious type of launcher. There are powerful crossbows in the game with different bonuses, most important of which are the speedy ones, granting a bonus attack, or even more than just one additional attack. Oh yes! Even though these speed crossbows are random drops, there are 3 spots to get one, with an increasing likelihood of success. The first one in Chapter 2 is a 1 out of 7 chance, the next one in Chapter 3 is a 1 out of 3 chance, and finally the last random drop in Chapter 6 is a 2 out of 3 chance. Additionally, that last drop is easy to reload for, if you want to make sure to obtain one. The magical ammunition is, as usual, a bit hard to come by, but there are good bolts in the game, and you can stock up on some in a few places. And finally, longbows deserve their own paragraph, as they destroy most of the competition by a huge margin, both in terms of quality and quantity. You could easily have like 3 longbow users, and have all of them exceptionally equipped, and not just by the end of the game, but well before that point. There are simply so many great options, both guaranteed as well as random drops. You can start out by buying composite longbows at the beginning of the game, which require only 15 strength to equip in Icewind Dale, by the way. Then magical ones start appearing in Chapter 1. In Chapter 2, there's a guaranteed speed longbow, the Messenger of Seth, which is a massive find at that point. Chapter 3 is a longbow bonanza, Chapter 5 has a nice static drop, and finally in Chapter 6 there's an insane longbow with high enchantment and a bonus attack, which is a particularly easy to reload for 50-50 random drop. In the expansion, right at the start, there's an inexpensive composite longbow +1 to buy, and if you're not against performing evil deeds, you can obtain the most ridiculous longbow in all of Infinity Engine gaming. It's crazy. As for ammo, there's quite a variety of different magical arrows in the game. Some are obtainable for free from adventuring, but for many others, we'll have to spend some big bucks to purchase. They are available in nice quantities, though, in a few shops. So, if you thought longbows were great in Baldur's Gate 1, well, time to play some Icewind Dale, my dude. Now, the time has come to present another significantly improved class compared to its Baldur's Gate equivalent, the Bard. The direct changes to the class mostly come down to the fact that in Icewind Dale, the Bard doesn't have just one song they can perform, but they gradually unlock new ones, to arrive at a grand total of 6 ballads with different properties. The Bard can switch freely between them, depending on the situation, and they are all useful in their own ways. Even the basic starting song is much better than what the unkitted Bard has in Baldur's Gate. Another thing, I'm mentioning more for thoroughness' sake, because it really only matters slightly in the end stages of a normal playthrough, and is meant more for playing with XP bonuses or on Heart of Fury. The spell progression of the Bard in Icewind Dale continues, allowing them to eventually cast level 7 and 8 spells, whereas in Baldur's Gate they can only gain access up to level 6. Finally, what indirectly makes the class more interesting is that the game has a lot of content to accommodate its abilities. Besides the unique Bard conversations and quest outcomes, or items only Bards can make use of, there are other minor elements that allow the class to prove useful. And I will lean into those opportunities and make our Bard, Iris, a true jack-of-all-trades, who will take care of many different tasks and activities. There will also be a lot of development for this character over the course of the playthrough, which I really enjoy. There's so much to talk about here that I'm struggling to decide where to start first. I guess let's begin with some basics, and then list her many out-of-combat utilities. She's a half-elf, for a bit of variety, but gameplay-wise it gives her a slightly higher pickpocketing value than a human would have. Her physical attributes don't grant any bonuses, intelligence is decent but too low to reliably scribe spells without buffs, and charisma is at its minimum. However, we can still work with it. Even though in Icewind Dale the arcane spell Friends increases charisma by 5 instead of 6, it's enough to give her exactly the boost she needs to access maximum discounts. Needless to say, she will be the one to do our shopping. She will also acquire items for us in a different way. Bards increase their pickpocketing skill naturally, and even though she has the minimum allowed dexterity, with the right consumables and buffs, including her own song, she will display the class's sticky finger capabilities. You need not worry though, as in this game you can't steal from merchants, and our pickpocketing will be limited to a few select targets to obtain a handful of notable items. And that's nice. Icewind Dale gives a purpose to the skill, with some relevant loot we can get that way, but it doesn't go any further than that. As a bard, she is by far the fastest progressing class in terms of lore, and that's not just convenience in Icewind Dale, but actually a pretty useful trait. There are long dungeon crawling segments of the game, spent away from shops or safe places to rest, and the existence of many random drops makes it less likely for the player to know exactly what they got. As a result, being able to identify most items on the go is a handy ability to have, and it will work well for the viewer experience in a video series like this. You'll be able to see the properties of our loot without having to wait a long time for an identification session. Another important aspect to the Bard is their job as a conversationalist or diplomat. There are quest outcomes unique to the Bard, or some additional experience or wealth to obtain through dialogues, but even outside of that, the class's attribute minimum values naturally lend themselves to handle those particular conversations that require both high intelligence and high charisma. The Bard can even upgrade an item by talking to a certain spirit, although you can also enlist the services of 2 NPCs for that. Finally, adding to the class's uniqueness, the game offers an assortment of bardic instruments, granting passive bonuses or offering a spell to cast. They will give Iris some additional options in combat. And speaking of that, when it comes to her performance in battle, it will be marked by versatility and will develop greatly during the run. Most of her time early on will be spent singing, providing the rest of the group with valuable boosts to their fighting skills. And upgrading the repertoire of songs over time will open more options for both in and even outside of combat. Songs are a great type of buff, readily available for whenever we need them, and also affecting other companions on our side, like summoned or charmed creatures. Iris will also be an important secondary arcane spellcaster in our team. At first, she will focus mainly on spells used before fights, like buffs or summons, but will still be able to throw in a quick combat spell here and there. As a bard, she will level up quickly, and that will lend itself nicely to spells that scale well with the caster's level, and she will prioritize learning such magic. Also, adding to her supportive role, she will learn the spells from magic schools our specialist mage won't have access to. All of that combined will make her an important spellcasting asset to our party. Finally, she will be able to engage in combat directly, especially later on in the playthrough. At first, she will be preoccupied with other tasks, and use weapons mostly on disabled enemies who can't avoid them. However, eventually, she will become a secondary archer of the group. This will be available due to a few different circumstances and developments lining up well together. With increasing levels, we will naturally improve our stats and unlock access to more potent combat buffs, which in turn will lessen the need to always have a song active. That, in combination with better equipment, both for the party and Iris herself, will open up archery as a viable alternative to singing. She will focus on crossbows, which fit perfectly for the task. It takes time for good weapons of that type to show up, as well as to stockpile some good bolts. I will put a bit of faith for us to obtain a nice speed crossbow from the possible random drops, but even if that doesn't happen, it's okay, because there are other decent crossbows we are guaranteed to get. And once the time is right, our sleeper bard will awaken and become a more active participant in fights, where it makes sense. At that point, she will have reached the peak of her combat versatility, being able to truly adapt to whatever is needed, be it casting spells, shooting her crossbow, or singing. It always brings me a lot of satisfaction to see the class grow so much in those areas, getting new songs, learning new magic, and becoming a more effective combatant. I just love having a bard in this game. Her role-playing background will be the most down-to-earth out of the whole bunch. Iris is a half-elf, but with dominant human traits, to the point where you would have to look closely to spot her slight elven features. She's a native, local resident of Icewind Dale, having enjoyed a peaceful upbringing in the city of Termalaine, near the lake Mare de Walden. She has since visited all of the 10 towns many times over, as a traveling minstrel, performing songs and helping out with minor seasonal tasks. As a daughter of a former soldier, she's been taught to use a crossbow, and being a fast learner with lots of interests, albeit too short-lived and shallow to stick with and develop strongly, she has picked up many basic skills, like pickpocketing, throwing knives, or casting simple cantrips. She's always been more of an artist, though, eagerly listening to all sorts of tales, legends, and stories, and trying to give them musical form. Iris is actually a stage name she fancied for herself. Being easily inspired and passionate, she has always yearned for something more, to not only sing about virtuous deeds, but to participate in performing them. To that end, she's been looking for an opportunity to join a group of adventurers and fulfill her dreams of taking part in important events. To be a hero in a grand adventure, like the ones she knows from epic ballads. Considering what she will soon get herself into, she will realize the meaning of the phrase, "Be careful what you wish for." In terms of faith, she is a worshipper of Timora, the Lady of Luck. Iris is a daring woman, trusting her chances, and thus not afraid of taking risks. In fact, she believes that only through the act of doing so, we can reach the heights of our potential. Her worship will also explain her fondness for Timora's melody, the song we will use the most. Now, making a min-maxed bard would mostly involve pumping up her stats and selecting optimal proficiencies for whatever combat role you'd like them to perform, but there's already a choice to make when it comes to the class itself. The baseline bard is of course the most versatile support type, fit for many parties, but we also have the Scald and Blade to consider for other purposes. The former is a great addition to a themed, battle-ready group, focused on physical damage. Having different sorts of warriors and their multi- and dual classes, boosted by the Scald's song, makes for a force to be reckoned with, capable of doing terrible, terrible damage. The Blade is a more self-contained, independent class, being essentially a type of fighter mage with its own flavor. A welcome inclusion for a lot of parties, especially when taking advantage of the many speed weapons Icewind Dale has to offer, both ranged and melee, making up for the traditional weakness of non-warrior classes, the low amount of attacks per round. Also, while everyone knows the benefits of offensive spin being one of the hallmarks of this kit, I'd like to highlight its less flashy counterpart and mention that there are numerous opportunities to achieve great results with a well-timed defensive spin, holding the line in choke points or providing some relief during ambushes or other dangerous situations. As for attributes, of course the physical stats will boost the bard's combat performance and base pickpocketing skill. Maxing intelligence will lessen the need to use as many consumables to guarantee success when scribing spells, but something to note when it comes to wisdom, besides the potential for a minor lore boost, is that a certain instrument, the unsung harp, requires 13 wisdom to use, as well as a non-evil alignment. It can cast a good spell, but it's at the end of the expansion content, so it's only relevant when going into Heart of Winter earlier in your route. And a final, small remark about proficiencies. For a more support-oriented singing bard, it's nice to invest a point into Sword and Shield style, for the boost to armor class against missile attacks, whilst wielding a melee weapon with a buckler, or the bardic offhand from Kuldahar, the Lyre of Progression. Even though it's not a shield, for the purposes of game mechanics, it works just as well, and will activate that bonus too. Finally, we have reached our last party member, Nadimastria the Invoker. The mage specialists in Icewind Dale aren't fundamentally different from their Baldur's Gate peers, except for their opposed magic schools. The relations between them are a bit less intuitive, as they don't always mutually counter each other like they do in BG. Also, more often than not, there are 2 opposed schools for a specialist instead of just 1. 5 out of 8 specializations carry that additional downside. It's a somewhat more truthful implementation of how things are in pen and paper AD&D, but with slight changes to it still. However, before we get to all that, let's take a step back and talk about the properties of mage specialists in general. Every specialized mage has an additional memorization slot available for each spell level, but is prohibited from casting spells that belong to his opposed magic school or schools. Specialists have an increased chance to successfully learn spells that belong to their specialty, but receive a penalty to scribing incantations of all other types. They benefit from a +2 bonus when making a saving throw against spells from their school, and finally, most importantly, they are more proficient when casting spells they specialize in, by imposing a -2 saving throw penalty against them on their targets. That last advantage is not listed here, but was discovered a few years ago by the community and has actually been present in all Infinity Engine games, from as far back as the first Baldur's Gate. And on newer patches of the Enhanced Edition, it's officially recognized and made its way into the class description. It lines up with a similar bonus in pen and paper, which I guess might have been the motivation to look for such a property within the game's engine. It's such a great bonus that I had to confirm it for myself, and indeed, it's working and will play an important role in our playthrough. This discovery is so groundbreaking because it changes the way of thinking about specialists and adds an important factor to the player's choice of specialty. Previously, one would make their decision based solely on which spells the mage would be restricted from casting. Now, however, there is also the consideration of what spells we want to make more effective by being harder to save against, which spells and spell schools gain the most out of this benefit, and so on. It makes the choice of specialization a much more exciting theory crafting element. As a minor side note, every specialist class has a certain attribute associated with it that a character has to have at 15 or 16 in order to be eligible for it. In the Infinity Engine games, it's a positive element because you choose your class first and roll stats later. Therefore, it elevates the minimum value of that attribute to the necessary amount. In pen and paper, however, it's a downside, an additional requirement for a character to satisfy before they can become a specialist. Now, let's talk about our specialty, evocation. It has two opposed schools, divination and conjuration. In order to become an invoker, one has to have a constitution of 16. This is why Nadimastria has it at such a high value. Evocation is a type of magic that delivers mainly offensive, damaging spells, but is not limited to just that. It's a very interesting and fun spell school to showcase in Icewind Dale, as the game provides a unique environment for magic and opportunities to, once again, do something different from Baldur's Gate. To start things off, there are many spells that will benefit from the Invoker's -2 saving throw penalty, as most of the evocation magic is targeted at enemies and allows a saving throw. Of course, the primary thing to address here is that most of the damage-inflicting spells allow the targets to reduce their received damage by half when they make their save. Being less likely to do so, they will suffer the full damage of our spells more often. However, beneath the surface of this observation lie more interesting conclusions. A notable thing to mention is that quite a few evocation spells, besides dealing damage, also carry a secondary effect, negated by a successful save. Ice Lance can stun, Shout can deafen, Death Fog can reduce attributes, and so on. With the Invoker's saving throw penalty in play, we will see those additional effects more often. And then finally, we have spells that are entirely neutralized when saved against. They are understandably a risky or questionable memorization choice, and normally don't see much use. However, on a specialist, it won't be such a bad idea to give them a chance and showcase their potential. All in all, the Invoker's saving throw penalty will be a constantly active element of Nadimastria's gameplay, and will allow us to explore a greater variety of viable spells. There are also other factors in Icewind Dale that add purpose to having an Invoker. The format of encounters in the game revolves around fighting larger groups of enemies, therefore spells with an area of effect are in high demand. Evocation offers plenty of those, both in terms of damage and crowd control. Indeed, potent disabling spells, Stinking Cloud and Web, belong to this school of magic. They will be even more effective in the hands of our Invoker, especially now that Web doesn't have its inherent -2 saving throw penalty we know from Baldur's Gate. Having our Specialist, we can kind of restore it. Things are different in Icewind Dale also in terms of wands. Over the course of the Baldur's Gate saga, there's never ever a need to memorize Fireball, Aganazar's Scorcher, Lightning Bolt, or Cloudkill, because there is an abundance of wands that provide access to those spells. Wizards in Baldur's Gate focus on preparing damage from other schools, like Acid and Flame Arrows from Conjuration, or Skull Traps and Horrid Wiltings from Necromancy. Here, however, damaging wands are much less common in general, and having a mage actually memorizing evocation magic has its place. Another consequence to having a specialist concerns scribing scrolls. There is both an advantage and a disadvantage here. We will be able to learn evocation spells on the go without setting up a special scribing session, that is, without buffing up Nadimastria's intelligence. However, for spells of different schools, she will need a full buff to at least 24 intelligence to guarantee success. Considering the fact that Potions of Genius, of Mind Focusing, and Red Potions are only available in limited supply in Icewind Dale, and we have a bard that needs them as well, we will have to plan their use carefully. Especially since there is only a single copy of many important spells in the game, so we absolutely cannot let them go to waste. In effect, Nadimastria won't be able to update her non-evocation spell selection too often, ending up as quite a specialized magician indeed. And lastly, a general note about arcane magic. Similarly to the divine spells, in Icewind Dale we'll have a different arsenal of casts to utilize, and many spells we know from Baldur's Gate will have changed in many regards. I'll point out those differences as we go along in the playthrough, of course. Now, finally, let's talk about Nadimastria in more detail. Being a mage, having a high intelligence and an evil alignment, will allow her to handle quite a few conversations based around those three characteristics. Also, even though it's not a big deal, the only items in the game restricted to evil characters are mage items, so she will be able to make use of those. Her attributes, as usual, are set to portray what kind of character she is. Being a wizard, her physical stats are weak, except that constitution she has to have at 16. It will give her plus 2 HP per level, but as a single-class mage, she will still be an extremely squishy character regardless. Her high intelligence is fitting, I feel, particularly for a specialist, and allows for that cool scribing feature I mentioned a moment ago. The value of 18 gives her a base 85% chance to successfully scribe spells, and with the 15% additive bonus coming from her specialization, learning evocation magic won't require any external help, but on the flip side, the minus 15% chance to all other scribing ensures that she won't try it with any other spells. In order to cater to the suboptimal philosophy and add another such measure, she will be restricted not only from divination and conjuration, but enchantment as well. I already like the Invoker having 2 prohibited schools, but enchantment absolutely should have been one of them, as the polar opposite to evocation. It wouldn't make sense for an Invoker to retain access to enchantment magic, in my opinion. For her starting spells, I have chosen Shield, Color Spray, and Burning Hands. This will require some explanation. Shield is to satisfy the necessary evocation pick, as well as to provide a defensive measure, with the added utility of blocking magic missiles. It comes into play a few times. If we didn't pick it here, we would either have to buy it, or only obtain it late in Chapter 1, already after missing out on a few opportunities to use its magic missile protection. The other evocation options are Magic Missile and Chromatic Orb. You might be surprised I didn't select the latter, as it is one of the best level 1 spells in Icewind Dale. The answer to that lies in the fact that we can get a hold of its scroll right at the beginning of the game, and precisely because of its magic school, Nadimastria will be able to learn it immediately. It also has more scrolls available soon after, so our bard will be able to eventually scribe it as well. Our second pick, Color Spray, will be our main crowd-controlling tool for the early stages and will remain useful over the course of the entire game. You'll see that this spell is much better than its BG equivalent. By securing it here, we won't have to wait for a dedicated scribing session to obtain this widely useful disabling spell on our Invoker. Now, having the necessities in place, the next choice is a more frivolous one, and it doesn't matter as much. There are a few possibilities, especially in terms of decent spells with only 1 scroll available in the game. That last property incentivizing picking something like that here for free. I went with Burning Hands to have a slight AoE spell early on, as well as an expendable fire damage source to finish off trolls later. Out of the classic Icewind Dale spells, other notable choices in my opinion are Grease, perhaps Shocking Grasp, and a case can be made for Sleep instead of Color Spray. I consider most other options inferior, due to either being generally weaker spells, or having more scrolls available in the game, or not being necessary to have right away from the start. For example, Magic Missile falls under multiple of those categories. It has a few easily accessible scrolls, and only produces a few projectiles on low levels, so it's not a very attractive early selection. You can simply get it later, through adventuring. Now, Grease, as a conjuration incantation, isn't available to Nadimastria, but speaking in a broader sense, it's a worthwhile pick. Even though it does have a scroll early in Chapter 1, it's beneficial to have it on more than 1 character, so it makes sense to select it for an arcane caster if you have more of them. When it comes to Shocking Grasp, it's not as strong of a pick. The only scroll for it is available deep in Chapter 1, which could motivate choosing it from the start, but on the other hand, the strength of this spell lies in its scaling. With some levels, it grows to be a decent source of damage for a level 1 cast that you can just throw out there, so you don't need it right away. And another negative aspect of it is that certain types of enemies are immune to electricity. Now, the BG1 powerhouse Sleep requires a few considerations. In the level 1 repertoire, it overlaps to a large extent with Color Spray, but these options are not exactly a one-to-one comparison. I think we'll delve into more details during the playthrough, and here I'll just say that it might be a valid selection if you have more than 1 arcane spellcaster. This is because a Scroll of Sleep is found immediately at the beginning of the game, and that's all you really need. Any generalist mage or bard with 18 intelligence will have an 85% chance of successfully learning it, while an enchanter will be guaranteed to do so. That's of course assuming you don't disable that mechanic or simply reload upon failure if that's your preference. Then it's really a no-brainer to obtain sleep through that scroll. However, I can see why someone would prefer to take it here as well, wanting to have it available on more characters, especially when playing on higher difficulties. Every memorization slot will be precious in the beginning, and even though Color Spray is a superior crowd control tool in general, it's not party-friendly and is not as easy to aim as Sleep. Also, Color Spray is fortunate enough to have multiple scrolls available in Chapter 1, so it's not a major factor to impact the decision. We won't be missing out on it either way. Therefore, it's not without reason to go all out on Sleep in the prologue and get Color Spray later. I've been talking at length about the situation at the start, and that finally brings me to yet another downside of Sleep I'd like to address. The beginning of the game is the only period of time when you can use the spell. Unfortunately, Sleep in Icewind Dale has no longevity. It is only effective during the prologue. Afterwards, all of the enemies, with very few minor exceptions, are not susceptible to it anymore, either through a natural immunity to this status effect or by being too high level. However, as a general remark, I would argue that you shouldn't always put much weight to this aspect when selecting your starting spells for a mage. The philosophy of only picking spells with maximum longevity is of course the correct one for a sorcerer, but if scroll availability isn't a problem for useful competing options, like Color Spray here, a mage doesn't necessarily have to choose in the same way. It's totally okay to take spells meant to only help out in the beginning, and Sleep works just fine for that purpose. Now, from the Enhanced Edition spells, the two main options are Find Familiar and Spook. The former is an okay pick, but you can simply buy the scroll early on in Chapter 1, and you don't need more than that, since only one character in your party can have a familiar. Spook, on the other hand, is worth considering. Its earliest scroll in the original campaign is only available from Chapter 2, which is an incentive to pick it up here. However, the downsides are that Panic is a status effect many opponents in the game are immune to, and it's only a single target spell, which oftentimes will not provide the impact we're looking for in large encounters. On the other hand, it scales with level, and from time to time, will be a nice tool to take a more prominent enemy out of the fight for a while. Now, to conclude this section and summarize our picks here, Nadimastria, after learning Chromatic Orb almost immediately at the start, will end up with a versatile level 1 selection with all bases covered. Shield for defense and utility, Color Spray for crowd control, Burning Hands for a fire-based AoE, and Chromatic Orb for single target damage and secondary effects. And for a final remark about arcane magic in our party, I just want to highlight a clear theme for both of our spellcasters. The Invoker and her focus on destructive and debilitating energies aimed at our opponents, and the Bard filling in the gaps and supporting us with a versatile selection of utilities. As for Nadimastria's role-playing background, first and foremost, the defining aspect of her character is that she is a Red Wizard of Thay. Most of what we'll talk about here will be derived from that fact. According to their general practice, Nadimastria, like all Thavian children, was tested for the affinity to magic at a young age by the Red Wizards. Exhibiting natural talents in the art and a high degree of intelligence, she was admitted into their ranks, eventually growing up to be a proficient and highly specialized spellcaster. Unfortunately, being exposed to their scheming, evil ways all throughout her life, her personality was heavily influenced as well. She inevitably became an arrogant and self-serving individual, concerned almost entirely about the pursuit of arcane power. She quickly realized, though, that constant scheming and power struggles, so prevalent among the Red Wizards, were a foolish distraction from what a self-respecting mage should be focusing on: developing their magical abilities and unlocking their full potential. Therein lies true power. Because of this, Nadimastria has never been interested in advancing through the red magic cult hierarchy, instead looking for ways to operate outside of the system and escape any bonds that would hamper her progress. She chose the researcher branch within the organization, hoping to continue her studies at one of the experimental research sites, away from Thay and away from rival mages scheming to take her place. Her wish was eventually granted, and she was sent to assist a Red Wizard operation in the far north. more on that later. Now, to get back to her in-game properties for a moment and make some connections, her neutral evil alignment is meant to reflect her flexible moral compass while pursuing her goals. She's not actively interested in performing evil acts, but at the same time, she's not opposed to them if it serves her purposes. For her, the end definitely justifies the means, and obtaining magical power is worth any price. Her high intelligence and decent wisdom point to her scholarly focus and mental capability. She's a gifted magician who strives to understand magic, acquire arcane insight, and absorb all the knowledge she can. She's able to stay somewhat grounded and reasonable in this, at least compared to other red wizards. She's less likely to commit mistakes typical for her power-obsessed colleagues. She knows the pitfalls of taking shortcuts and cutting corners. She knows how futile the internal fights are, how meaningless titles are. She understands the long-term nature of her goals, and that she cannot waste her time and energy with trivial matters like these. As a red wizard, she's highly specialized and dedicated to her chosen school of magic. Depending on the edition of D&D, the details change, but what remains constant about the red wizards is that they are always specialists and forego using more magic schools than usual. With our choice of specialty, the additional restriction, and the focus on learning mainly evocation spells, we are well in line with this profile. Her starting proficiency is in daggers, which I've always thought are the most fitting for evil spellcasters. I imagine that, if they had to get their hands dirty and use a weapon, it would have to be a dagger in the back of a betrayed companion or an unsuspecting enemy, that sort of thing. Finally, the matters of faith. She would never admit to worshipping any gods, and doesn't consider herself a follower of anyone or anything, but deep down inside, she does hold two divine powers in some reverence. The first of them is Mystra, the mother of all magic, and the godly embodiment of the weave, the arcane energy Nadimastria seeks to understand and master. It is a natural admiration for a magical scholar like her. The second deity she has respect for is Kossuth, the Lord of Flames. His worship is popular in Nadimastria's homeland, to the point of his largest temple in all the realms, the Flaming Brazier, being located in Eltabar, the capital of Thay. Kossuth is the patron behind her favorite element, fire, powering her spells. A destructive force she is intimately familiar with as a devoted practitioner of evocation magic. Even though she holds these divine powers in high esteem, she will always put herself in first place. She's pragmatic above all else, so despite her strong preference for fire, she won't be averse to using other elements if it serves her purposes, and she would surely not sacrifice her plans in the name of any gods or ideologies. Now, as to her presence in Icewind Dale and in our group. She's been a part of a secret research project in the north for a while. Somewhere between Luskan and Mirabar, near the spine of the World Mountains, is a remote red wizard outpost, where transmutation and evocation experiments are conducted with the use of spell components only available in the region. It's been a perfect place for Nadimastria to continue her studies, unhindered by rigid rules and schedules. The wizards stationed here, far from Thay, slowly abandoned many overly strict traditions and rituals in favor of more practical methods. It is why, for instance, the practice of shaving their heads wasn't really followed anymore. However, orders bearing a seal of the Council of Zulkirs arrived recently, with a mission of great importance that couldn't be ignored. Scrying magic in Thay had revealed that an artifact of immense power emerged in the north and made its presence known to those with keen magical senses. It was decreed that an expedition of red wizards is to immediately set out in search of this artifact, to discover its whereabouts or even obtain it, if possible. Nadimastria instantly volunteered to be a part of this undertaking, and soon after, began the journey to reach the 10 towns. Even though her group numbered a handful of mages, she made sure to arrive in East Haven alone, as she will stop at nothing to acquire the magical powers of that artifact for herself. When it comes to optimized versions of a character like this, I don't think I need to elaborate more than I already did about the power of dual classes. It would be just more of the same here, making a fighter specializing in longbows, or a berserker or Kensai built for dual-wielding some of the premium one-handers are some obvious choices for the starter class, who would then go on to become a mage. You've all heard me talk enough about it. What I would like to focus on in this segment instead is another pure class arcane spellcaster, the Sorcerer, and how it completely breaks Icewind Dale in a certain aspect. It's of course a traditionally powerful class, but with even more advantages that apply specifically in this game. I've talked quite a bit already about some spells that only have a single available scroll in the whole game, but that was only the tip of the iceberg. There's many more of them, or spells with just 2 scrolls. Oftentimes there's one in the original campaign and the other in the expansion. Whatever the case might be, the general issue of scroll scarcity means that in numerous instances you'll only have one spellcaster capable of learning a particular spell. Now, having a class that doesn't need scrolls at all already sounds pretty good, but there's an even more relevant consequence of it. The Sorcerer breaks the intended arcane power progression of the game entirely. The fact of the matter is that most scrolls in Icewind Dale are only obtainable through adventuring, and since it's a linear game, you're only going to get access to certain magic when you get far enough in the story to acquire it. So even though you might have access to, let's say, level 4 spells way ahead of arriving in Chapter 3, you won't be able to cast Emotion Hope or Emotion Courage until you get their scrolls in that chapter. Now, whether you agree with that design choice or not, the fact remains. This is when you are meant to gain access to those powerful buffs. However, the Sorcerer doesn't care about any of it. The moment you unlock level 4 spells on that class, you just select Emotion Hope, for instance, and start using it right away. That argument goes even further with some of the Enhanced Edition spells, like Improved Haste, the scroll of which is only available in the expansion. No worries though, as soon as your Sorcerer gets access to level 6 spells in the original campaign, you can just pick that spell up and reap the benefits of your choice. Now again, I don't mean to harp on the issues of game balance and such, but as we're talking about powerful wizard characters, well, a Sorcerer can very well be one, for those or other reasons. It's just something I wanted to bring up, as an interesting aspect to consider, and up to the player's discretion and how they are willing to use it, of course. Whew. Well, I think that's about it when it comes to our party. I really enjoy discussing these matters, but after all this talking, let's finally make one step closer to actually playing the game and get ourselves into the proper mood by watching the intro cinematic to Icewind Dale.
They say that history is the greatest of all teachers, and that tales of past deeds define who we are in the present, and what we shall be in the future. It is said that such tales shall, with each telling, illuminate us all with the light of truth. I shall tell you of such a tale. It is a tale quite familiar to me, for I have spent nearly a lifetime piecing it together and chronicling it here within this book. For years I have pondered its passages, studying every line, committing each word to memory. Perhaps now, in the telling of it, I shall at last find the answers I seek. Our story takes place in the northern region of Faerun, known as Icewind Dale. It is a harsh, frozen land, cut off from the rest of the world by a wall of jagged peaks called the Spine of the World. For centuries, the icy plains of the Dale have been home to the barbarian peoples of the Uthgard and Regedmund. Huddled together in small, closely knit tribes, the barbarians lived simple lives, free, proud, and fiercely independent. Until the day an archmage named Erakan came to Icewind Dale. With an army of mercenaries, Erakan sought to conquer the north and force the fierce barbarians into slavery. Long weeks of battle followed, and the scattered barbarian tribes suffered terrible losses. Defeat seemed inevitable. In their darkest hour, a barbarian shaman named Jared came forth and demanded a council between all the remaining tribes of the north. A respected warrior, Jared persuaded the council to put aside their differences and unite against Erakan. Strengthened by a new sense of purpose, the barbarians rallied behind their new leader. The combined might of the Northmen proved more than a match for Arakan, who had counted on the division of the tribes. Wave after wave of barbarian warriors tore into Arakan's hired army, forcing them on the defensive and ultimately into full retreat. As his army crumbled around him, Arakan had time for one last desperate act before his enemies descended upon him. Drawing upon his remaining power, the Archmage breached the planar boundaries, tearing open a portal to the lower planes. The foolish Archmage's cries of victory immediately turned to shrieks of terror as the hideous and twisted shapes of demonkind materialized from the portal and poured onto the battlefield. The sudden appearance of the demons drove the combatants, barbarian and mercenary alike, to turn to meet the new threat side by side. The remaining warriors bravely charged the portal to drive the hellspawn back and were slaughtered by the hundreds. As his people fell around him, the barbarian shaman, Jared, looked up from the blood-drenched snow of the battlefield and caught sight of a lone figure high upon a ridge in the distance. Jared immediately recognized this vision as an omen from his god Tempus, and in that instant, he knew what had to be done. Shouting cries to his god, he charged through the ranks of the demons and plunged into the portal. As Jared's blood fused with the energies of the portal, an explosion of white light engulfed the battlefield. When the light subsided, the demons were gone, and the portal was closed. In its place hovered a disk of solid stone. Frozen within the center of the disk was Jared's body, locked in his final moment of agony, in his final moment of triumph for all eternity. But that is not the end of our tale. It is but the beginning.
Nice. That gave us some backstory and some info about the setting, and one final thing we need to do is to go through the introductory in-game sequence as our tale begins here.
Our tale begins here, in the quiet fishing village of Easthaven, one of the so-called 10 towns of Icewind Dale. The tiny community is hardly a town, but rather a collection of ramshackle huts crowded together upon the icy shores of Lech Dinashir. Here, within a dimly lit tavern, a group of travelers sit huddled around a table, swapping tales and making grand plans for the future, completely unaware of the part they are to play in the events that are about to unfold.
What's this? New face in town, eh? Well met, stranger. The name is Hrothgar, originally of Hillsfar. But now, after years of traveling up, down, and under Faerun, I am content to call this town my home. Who might you be?
Greetings, Hrothgar. My name is Rintar, and these are my companions.
Well then, welcome to Easthaven. Whatever your business in these parts might be, I would offer you this small piece of advice. While you're in my town, you do well to be on your best behavior. These folk are under my protection, and anyone who would seek to do harm to them in any way shall answer to me. That said, I'll let you get back to your cups. I'm sure you've had a long journey, and you'll find there's no better way to shake off the cold of the road than by downing a few mugs of Grisella's best. And if you're in need of lodging, I would recommend talking to Quimby over at the Snowdrift Inn over on the east side of town. Equipment and supplies can be purchased next door at Pomab's Emporium. Pomab's prices are a bit high, even for a Kalashite. But you'd be better off well-equipped and short of coin than the other way around. Ill-prepared travelers don't last long in these parts. Once you've had a chance to rest up and get your bearings, come by and see me at my house. It's just a couple doors west of here. There's some business I would discuss with you. Farewell.
We will. Until then, farewell. And I'm afraid I will also have to bid a fond farewell to you, dear viewers, because we have finally arrived at the end of this episode. Hope you join me next time for the proper start of the gameplay, where we will explore this lovely town and get our adventure underway. Thank you for watching, and see you there. It offers the intended mechanics and values for the In Icewind Dale, alignment influences the Cleric's selection of available. Bray doesn't worship. Wow. And she definitely doesn't mind tricking or stealing from whom she did.